But unfortunately, it'll never happen.
Front! Punches! It punches! And it's over!
I think it's going to be over.
Aguero in big trouble against the ropes!
I have to say there seems an element of genuine hate between these two, Ambrose.
For sure. I don't hate the man.
Just imagine if you bought a ticket. Stop it, Greg. You can stop it any time. Castillo's in trouble. Weak steps in, and the fight is over.
Welcome back to the Legendary Nights podcast, Season 4, episode number 10. The Season 4 finale is right here, and it is a historical tale between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries, one of the original super fights of boxing. And in this episode, we are going to be covering their intertwining careers. We've done stuff with Jack Johnson previously on his career profiles episode, but Jim Jeffries has only had passing mentions in some of these old time episodes. So to be doing Jim Jeffries in this episode, one that many people have requested, a fighter that many people have wanted us to cover, I hope you guys that have been requesting Jim Jeffries to be covered on this show are happy. It might not be a career profile, that will come in the future, but having Jim Jeffries and telling his story to some capacity for this episode, I'm sure that you guys that have requested it will be really happy to hear some of the stuff that we've got for the episode. But it's a great way to end this particular season by covering a fight which, as I said before, was one of the original super fights of this sport. And whilst it might not feel that way to many people listening to this episode right now, once you've heard the content, once you've heard the stories of Johnson and Jeffries, I think you'll change your opinion on what you think you know about it or what you think your perception of it was originally. So Johnston, bringing you in for an introduction to this final episode of the season. Johnson Jeffries is one that's been on the horizon for us for some time because we do love covering some of these older episodes because quite simply it educates us as podcasters and boxing fans, doesn't it?
Absolutely does. There's a lot been written, a lot of documentaries, I suppose. I mean, that you got the Jack Johnson long documentary to go into some great detail on this fight. And, you know, Jim Jeffries, the one thing probably about him is, and why people probably request him, is this is the fight he really is famed for. You know, the other stuff that he did before that, you know, it's almost voided in a way because when you think of Jeffries, you always think of this fight. So, and he's probably unfair because, you know, he's out of the ring for 6 years before he returns again. And it's almost like, I did read a couple of times, a few people were saying or suggesting that it's like judging Muhammad Ali against Larry Holmes, that sort of thing, where you wouldn't do that, would you? You know, and that's basically what this is. Although Jeffries did manage to get himself in shape, you know, the fight itself is very one-sided, but the tale of it is epic. It really is. And I think we've probably managed to capture that in a nutshell. And of course, with the times, there's going to be some racial slurs within it, and we will be saying some unsavoury language because that was it, and that was the time, and that was what this fight was. It was very race-orientated.
Now, we are going to begin by talking about Jim Jeffries himself. Now, while working as a boilermaker, hence his nickname, and for a meat-packing company, among other jobs, James Jackson Jeffries boxed at the East Side Athletic Club. In his first professional fight at age 19, he knocked out Hank Griffin in the 14th round. But his professional career was stopped short at breakfast time the next morning, and Jim himself recalled, "Mother looked up from the morning paper and said, 'Young man, you're not of age yet.' Mother looked at me very straight. She was a gentle, quiet woman, and it must have looked funny to see her bossing her 200-pound boy around. And she told me, 'Until you're of age, you're under my care, Jim, and I want no more of this.' And I said, 'All right, Mother.'" Jeffries then waited until he was 21 to box professionally full-time, honouring his promise to his mother. He was undefeated as a heavyweight, and then he signed with a new manager, William A. Brady, who was able to get his man for a fight with the world heavyweight champion, Bob Fitzsimmons, at the Coney Island Athletic Club. With the help of middleweight Tommy Ryan, Jeffries devised a new fighting style that he explained himself in 1936. He said, The night I fought Fitzsimmons for the title, I was 24 years old, weighed 200 pounds, could run the 100 metres in under 11 seconds and could do the standing high jump to the height of my shoulders. I fought from a crouch that made it hard to hit me where it hurt. Fitz was the greatest body puncher there was, but he wrecked his hands on me that night. I fought with my left hand extended, and I had a knockout in it that never travelled more than a few inches. It was that left followed by a right uppercut that ended the fight in the 11th round, knocking out Fitzsimmons and taking the world title on June 9th, 1899. 15 months earlier, in March 1898, Jeffries knocked out the Black Prince Peter Jackson, who was avoided by many and who we believe would have been the first black heavyweight champion if he had been given the chance. But the first gloved boxing heavyweight champion, John L. Sullivan, refused to fight him because of his race. Sullivan drew the colour line to evade a match with Peter Jackson, who was the world's most esteemed fighter in the late 1880s, and who, of course, we have done a career profile on, where we do go through this in great detail, so please do go back and listen.
We did. So when Jeffries and Jackson actually met in the ring in 1898, the Boilermaker was a young fighter who was trying to earn a shot at that world title that, of course, he won from Bob Fitzsimmons. By contrast, Jackson was the much older and he was a former shadow of himself, while Jeffries was in his prime and went on to knock out the great Jackson in only 3 rounds. As a champion, Jeffries followed in the footsteps of his predecessors and drew the colour line, opting to fight only white men. Big Jim, as many called him, stood over 6 foot and weighed over 200 pounds. His speed and punching power was too much for all the white contenders that he faced. In 1900, he met the former champion, Gentleman Jim Corbett, who was far ahead on points in the 23rd round when Jeffries caught him with a deadly left, knocking out one of the greatest boxing technicians the sport had ever seen to that point. Jeffries repeated his knockouts of Fitzsimmons and Corbett, sending them packing in the 8th and 10th rounds respectively. The Fitzsimmons rematch demonstrated his ability to absorb punishment and recover from a severe beating to win. For nearly 8 rounds, Fitzsimmons subjected Jeffries to a vicious beating where he suffered a broken nose, both of his cheeks were cut to the bone, and gashes were over both of his eyes. It appeared that the fight would have to be stopped as blood freely flowed into Jeffries' eyes, but he still managed to find that knockout blow. In July of 1903, Big Jim produced the finest performance of his career in a rematch with Gentleman Jim Corbett at the Pavilion. He dominated the fight from start to finish, putting Corbett down in the 4th and 6th rounds. In the 10th, Jeffries sent him to the canvas with a left hook to the body. Gentleman Jim got up, but was finished by a right in the same spot. Now, following these title defences, Jeffries was unable to find worthy opponents. So in August 1903, he actually announced that when there are no more white men to fight, I will quit the business.
2 months later, the Washington Post explained why they believed that Jeffries' reluctance to not fight black fighters was actually acceptable. And it reads, out in San Francisco, they are making heroic efforts to force Jeffries to fight a coloured man. But so far, the champion has turned a deaf ear to all propositions in which the withdrawing of the colour line is a prominent factor. He has declared himself that unless the public in general made a demand that he should meet a coloured man, he would under no circumstances enter the ring against one. This is the same stand that John L. Sullivan took when he was the champion. There is only this difference, that when Sullivan was champion, we had a coloured fighter named Peter Jackson, who, as later events proved, could have disposed of John L. Sullivan. But there is no coloured man in the business that can even make Jeffries extend himself. The colour line has been a disturbing element for years among the fighters. It has served as a shield from defeat in many cases, and then again, some of the fighters have been on the level when they declared against it. Some fighters are either born in the South or from Southern parents, and therefore cannot overcome the prejudice against a black man that is virtually installed into their minds from childhood. So, It must appear that in drawing the colour line against these men, it is nothing more or less than a case of fear. With Jeffries, however, it is different because the same circumstances do not exist that existed then. If the champion has really made up his mind to refuse to meet the Blackbirds, it is nobody's business but his own, and his refusal will not cause any loss of prestige.
In the same month, on October 1903, the Los Angeles Times actually published the following evaluation with the headline, "It's up to you, Champion Jeffries." The report clarified its opinion of a new fighter who was being identified as a potential contender to that heavyweight crown. And it read, "Jack Johnson is now the logical opponent for Champion Jeffries. Easily the master of his race as a boxer's game, possessed of undeniable ability. The colour line gag does not go now. It is pay or play in the fighting business. Johnson has met all comers in his class, has defeated each and every one. Jeffries, thus far, has met all comers. Will he turn down this one? Hardly. He cannot afford to do it. The public demands a fight from a champion on the behalf of Jack Johnson. Jeffries must heed the call. He wants one hard fight for the championship to show he is in that exalted position by ability as well as by the kindness of nature. Johnson is the man who will give him a chance to show the best that is in him. If he can beat the Negro, need never fight again." And so now we're going to move over to Jack Johnson and his rise to the position of a heavyweight contender. Now, we have done a career profile on the legendary Jack Johnson, so please do go back and listen to that episode for more details on his ascent of the world title or heavyweight glory. Jack first got noticed in 1898 at the Springfield, Illinois Battle Royal, where he was actually offered food, a place to stay, a purse of $1.50 if he was the last man standing. Now, we have explained this outrageous contest before and this particular fight, Battle Royal with Jack Johnson in it, but we're going to explain it again.
Jack was the fifth member added to the Battle Royale. His four opponents were friends and had already agreed on the winner and decided to split the money amongst themselves. With that, they decided to all attack the stranger, as in Johnson, at the bell. Retreating to a corner and with his back to the ropes, Johnson knocked out the first two with right hands to the jaw, then connected to the midsection of the third, dropping him to his knees like he was praying, as Johnson remembered. He chased the fourth man, a big red-haired fellow, until he could corner him and knock him out too. When the man was dropped with a body shot and showed signs of struggling to his feet, Johnson stood over him and whispered, "If you get up, I will kill you." He smartly stayed down, and Johnson won the contest. After celebrating with 30 sandwiches and a dozen beers, Jack's fortunes had changed. The referee, George Seiler, also known as Honest George, could not stop talking about Johnson on the train home and beyond, which actually got Jack a fight on an undercard in Springfield, which he lost, but it was still recognition. He went on to become a sparring partner for Frank Crafty Texan Childs, which didn't work out, and with his good friend, Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, he fought the brilliant Jewish heavyweight Joe Bartlett Chinoyski, where the fight was stopped with Johnson on the floor and both being arrested for engaging in an illegal contest. Now, as the story goes, they both spent 23 days in prison together, and Johnson remembered 2 days longer than a man who had killed his wife. During their time behind bars, the old master was able to show Johnson some of his tricks of the trade, jabbing, feinting, and slipping punches.
So following on from those lessons from Chinoyski in the Nick, Johnson was now beginning to demonstrate his own distinctive style in the ring. He was smooth, laid back, defensive, took few chances, countered his opponents when they made mistakes, or he used his huge frame to tie them up. Many considered his style a not fan-friendly style. When Jim Corbett demonstrated the same skills when he defeated John L. Sullivan, he became the new world champion. Sports pages actually praised him as the cleverest man in boxing. But when Johnson performed that way, he was said to be a lazy, shiftless, showing the yellow streak which all Afro-Americans were supposed to share. Johnson began to establish himself when he joined what he called a motley crew of scrappers, which included heavyweights Tom Sharkey, Bob Armstrong, and Mexican Pete Everett, welterweight New York Jack O'Brien, featherweights Abe Patel, young Corbett II, and George Dixon, and world-class trainers at the time Spider Kelly and Tommy Ryan, former middleweight. They would spend weeks fighting local challengers in Denver and battling each other when no one else had the bottle to face them. Johnson was now beginning to make a name for himself, especially after crushing Jim Jeffries' brother Jack and remaining active. And they were wins over Klondike Haynes at Memphis for a second time, and he was held by another guy called Billy Stiff to a second draw in Chicago, and he drew twice more with Hank Griffin and won a decision over Mexican Pete Everett in Colorado. He won the coloured heavyweight championship against Denver Ed Martin in 1903 and made impressive defences against the young and green Sam McVeigh, Frank Childs, and then knocked out Denver Ed Martin. He knocked him actually unconscious in their rematch. And after that, this was when Johnson, after that win, said, "I want Mr. Jeffries next. I think I'm entitled to a fight with him, and it was to prove that I am right that I went in this way tonight. I am faster than ever and bigger and stronger. I guess everybody knows it."
The colour line, Johnson added, was time-worn, old, and what cowardly four flushers stand by. His white manager, Tom McCary, then announced to the press that he would offer a $15,000 guarantee for a match with Jim Jeffries. The Police Gazette agreed now that Johnson, who was fast as an electric spark and as full as power as a 90-horsepower automobile, had so spectacularly defended his colour title. Jeffries had no right to draw the colour line. The press began to raise some serious questions about their white world champion, especially after he had fought other black fighters in Peter Jackson, Hank Griffin and Bob Armstrong. So, why not Johnson? Jeffries finally broke his silence by saying, "I do not care whether Johnson licks the Japanese army. I have repeatedly declared that so long as I am in the fighting business, I will never make a match with a black man. Just tell the public that James J. Jeffries has made up his mind that he will never put on boxing gloves to give battle to an Ethiopian." Now, not long after this statement, Johnson tracked the champion down at the San Francisco saloon owned by Jim Corbett's brother Harry and demanded his chance at the title. Surrounded by his mates, Jeffries said again that he would never meet Johnson or any other black challenger in the ring. Then, he later claimed he put $2,500 on the bar and told Johnson he'd fight him in the cellar alone. If Johnson managed to make it back up the stairs, he could keep the money. Johnson replied, "I ain't a cellar fighter," to which Jeffries and his friends laughed before shouting back, "A four-flusher? You're not even a three-flusher." Johnson continued to publicly demand Jeffries meet him in the ring, but after being knocked back, he decided to target the next top challenger in line, Marvellous Marvin Hart, who had also drew the colour line.
And that story, Jeffries did say that he neither denied it or admitted it. So it was one of those, did it happen? We're not too sure. Probably did. It's a great story anyway. So when the public pressure for a fight with Johnson grew, Jeffries explained to a reporter his reasons for his firm racism. He said, "I don't think the public wants me to defend my title against anyone but a white man. Don't think I'm afraid of a Negro. I'm not. They can be licked just as easily as anybody else. I simply have promised myself that I would fight only white men, and I won't break my word." Well, 2 months later, in April 1904, Jeffries and his manager announced that he would retire in a year, but this only increased the criticism against him and his unwillingness to fight Johnson. Demands from the public and the press, however, did not affect Big Jim's position. He remained firm on the colour line. Jeffries dismissed all the challenges issued by Jack Johnson and announced, "I pass Johnson up because he is coloured. I have said I will never box a coloured fighter and I won't change my mind. If any white fighter, no matter who he is, makes a good enough showing in the business to satisfy me that he would draw enough money in a fight with me, I will gladly take him on." I'm ready for the fight and will defend the title at all times and against all comers. Johnson finally got his shot at Marvin Hart the following year in San Francisco, and he went into the fight as a heavy favourite and confident of victory. However, he was unaware that the promoter of the fight, Alex Greggins, would also officiate the bout. He made his point before the fight. He said, "I have notified Johnson that he must fight all the time or the fight will be called no contest." Johnson dominated the first 10 rounds with ease, but refused to follow up on his work. Instead, he would step back and admire it.
The next 9 rounds were close, and Hart hurt Johnson to the body, which slowed him down. Then, just before the bell, at the end of the 20th and final round, a flashbulb went off. Both men were momentarily blinded and walked for their corners thinking the fight was over. Hart was the quickest to realise the fight was actually still active, so he launched himself at Johnson and hit him with a solid right hand that made Johnson stagger at the bell. Greggins, who was never going to give Johnson the win if it went the distance, of course gave the fight to Hart. Jim Jeffries sat at ringside smiling. Johnson felt robbed, and he said, "After fighting until I reached the top, I have been thrown down by an unfair ruling." He demanded a second shot at him, promising to beat him in every round this time. But Hart just laughed. Johnson has enough yellow in him to paint City Hall. Johnson is a fancy boxer, but when he gets stung, he is strictly a tin canner and staller. I'll never fight another black man. Now in March 1905, 2 months before the promised retirement, Jeffries provided yet another explanation for his reluctance to fight Johnson. He said, "No other heavyweight champion ever fought a coloured man for the title, and I'll tell you right now that I'm not going to set the fashion. As long as there are white men to fight, I will defend my title, but otherwise, I'll retire." Jeffries then destroyed Jack Monroe in the second round, the final defence of his world heavyweight title, before officially announcing his retirement. He told the press, "I have concluded to retire because there is no one in sight capable of giving the public a run for its money, and as I never took any money on false representations, it is too late to begin now."
Sounds like he ran away from Johnson to me. Well, on the day of his retirement, he also said that, "I am glad to get out of the limelight. The championship has brought me no happiness, nothing but cheap notoriety and a little money." Jeffries had indeed officially cleaned out all the white contenders, but of course not Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight that everyone wanted him to fight. As Jeffries wrote in his autobiography, "I was 29 years old, in fine physical condition and anxious to fight when I realised how Alexander felt when he sighed for more worlds to conquer. There were no more heavyweights left for me to meet, and I found no pleasure in the idea of going around and knocking out a lot of young fellows with more courage than skill or strength." He then announced that he would surrender his title and was given the option to pass it on to the fighter of his choosing. There was speculation that he would give it or hand the belt over to Bob Fitzsimmons, who had become very close friends with him, but that idea was scrapped. Instead, he would give it to the victor of a match between Marvin Hart, the guy that beat Johnson, and Jack Root, that was to be held in Reno on July 3rd, 1905. Jeffries, however, expressed his contempt to the future champion, announcing that he would refuse to honour the tradition of giving that title to his successor as a gift. Jeffries spelled out his thoughts also on that Hart and Root fight. He said, "They have hardly qualified for it, and there are other and better men who are entitled to look in for it. The man who wears it after me fight good and hard for it, and I don't think it will fall to either Root or Hart to wear it." So on July 4th, 1905, Marvin Hart became the world heavyweight champion after knocking out Root in the 12th round. Hart was a forgettable champion. Now, after cheating Jack Johnson out of victory in that fight before he won the world title, he actually went on to lose it to Tommy Burns in February 1906.
4,000 fans and Jack Johnson were in attendance, as was Jim Jeffries, who actually agreed to referee the contest. The much bigger man, Marvin Hart, won the fight by knockout, and he declared that he would face any man in the world in a fair fight. However, that challenge does not extend to anybody that is black. Of course, this wasn't the music that Jack Johnson wanted to hear in his ears, because there was a condition put in place for the winner of this world title fight, that of course the winner would have to fight a white contender. And in other words, the quote is, give the white boys a chance first. Now, Jim Jeffries, of course, was the first heavyweight champion to retire, and that new champion, as I said, was openly saying that he would fight any man, apart from black people. And when Jim Jeffries was interviewed later on down the line in 1936, this is what he said. When I retired back in 1904, a lot of the old experts claimed I was unbeatable, that I was just naturally so big and tough and strong that there was no use expecting any other fighter to beat me. I never did agree with that. I was not a natural. I was a made fighter. Meanwhile, Jack Johnson, he had to get back to actively fighting other black contenders for most of the next 2 years. He continued to chase white fighters, but they all ignored his calls. Instead, he fought the same black fighters over and over again. He fought Joe Jeanette 6 times between May of 1905 and September of 1906, winning 5 and losing 1, which was by disqualification. The crowds were small, and so was the money. Johnson was now getting desperate for a big money fight. With the money evaporating quickly, he was not able to live the luxurious lifestyle he was famed for. Johnson made a legitimate defence against an up-and-coming heavyweight from Canada on April the 26th, 1906, in Massachusetts, against Sam Langford. Now, we have gone into detail about this fight, so please go and check out the Sam Langford career profile. And in summary, Johnson knocked Langford down in the 6th round en route to a 15-round decision.
So Johnson actually acquired a new manager, Sam Fitzpatrick, who immediately announced that his fighter would gladly meet all of the leading white heavyweights, and that was Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Sam Berger or Al Kaufman, on a winner-takes-all basis, provided that Jeffries would agree to fight him once he'd knocked them all out of contention. None of them took the bait, forcing one sports writer to call them the yellowest pack of pigeon-livered mutts that ever disgraced the pages of pugilistic history. With nothing left in the US, Fitzpatrick decided to take Johnson to Australia, where they remained for the first part of 1907. When he returned, he began his mission to get a world title shot against the now champion Tommy Burns, who had agreed to fight Bill Squires at Colma on July 4th. Before we speak of this fight, let's explain what Jim Jeffries had been doing during his retirement. So Big Jim was enjoying a prosperous lifestyle that would eventually add an extra 50 pounds to his fighting weight. It would actually go up to 100, believe it or not. He attended to his alfalfa farm and hunted, as explained in the history of Burbank from the 1967 Burbank Unified Schools. It read, in 1904, national attention was drawn to Burbank when James J. Jeffries, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, bought 107 acres for a ranch on Victory Boulevard. He paid $2,000 down and assumed a $10,000 mortgage. Only 10 acres were actually placed under cultivation, and the rest was sagebush and sand. Jeffries later developed another 93 acres and planted alfalfa. The market price for alfalfa dropped shortly after his time, and it did not pay Jeffries to harvest his crop. He decided to put cattle on the land to eat the alfalfa. This proved to be a prosperous enterprise, and Jim Jeffries became one of the country's foremost suppliers for thoroughbred bulls. Most of them were sold in Mexico and South America, thus establishing Burbank's first foreign trade relations.
Jeffries was offered lucrative financial offers to quickly seduce him into reconsidering his retirement. In December of 1906, he published the following announcement: I have decided to enter the ring again. The only provision I make is that a purse of $50,000 be hung up, and some man selected as my opponent by those who are able to judge of the abilities of various fighters. The only other provision I make is that the man who faces me in the ring shall be a white man. God made me a white man, and I am willing to fight any man in the world. Some are willing to fight Negroes, and the story of the prize ring shows that the white man is at least the equal of the Negro. But first, last, and all the time, please quote me as saying that I draw the colour line. I always have and always will. No worthy white opponent picked up the challenge, and Jeffries remained at his California farm. When he wasn't on his farm, he visited Europe, drank beer, and also visited brothels. In August of 1907, Jim was well out of shape, but he played with the idea of a return to the ring, again telling reporters, "I will fight any white man if I can get in shape. The only man I bar of the ring at present is Jack Johnson. I will not fight Johnson or any other Negro, and that is final." In 1907, Tommy Burns knocked out Bill Squires to lay his definitive claim to the heavyweight title. Refereeing that night was, of course, Jim Jeffries, who said afterwards, "Burns can have the title unless he should be defeated by some foreigner. That's the only chance to get me back in the ring."
It sounded like he had a few beers when he was doing some of them quotes, I think. On July 17, Johnson fought ex-champion Bob Fitzsimmons at the National Athletic Club in Philadelphia. Fitzsimmons was 45 years old, out of shape, and had a torn ligament in his left bicep just before the bout. Bob actually did well in the first 3 minutes, showing the crowd what they had once saw in his heyday, but he was knocked out in the second. After Johnson knocked out fireman Jim Flynn unconscious for 4 minutes, he said after, "I think that I have demonstrated to the world that I am not afraid, and I challenge anyone to find the yellow in me. Tommy Burns is my next man, and I stand ready to fight him anytime." The St. Louis Dispatch agreed that Johnson deserved a world title shot. It read, "Jack Johnson is a coloured man, but we cannot get away from the fact that he is the greatest living exponent of the art of hit and get away, and as such is the outstanding challenger for the title which Tommy Burns claims, but to which he is not entitled until he puts Johnson out of the way. It's up to Tommy Burns to heed the call of the fight fans." In November of 1907, Johnson called out Jeffries again. He said, "I am so sorry Jim Jeffries ever drew the collar line, because I hate to see him retire from the ring forever without first whipping me and then have a clear title. You see, so many people believe that Jeffries would lick me in a punch, that it seems rather tough on me to have it all on the other fellows except Jeffries, and then to have no chance to win the honour, providing I am the man who can do it. I wish you would come back and take me on."
Interestingly, Johnson did not believe Jeffries was scared of him, and he actually said he did not draw the colour line because he was afraid. He drew it because he did not want to fight me on account of my colour. But I believe I ought to be given a chance. Johnson toured doing vaudevilles in 1908, billing himself as Jack Johnson, heavyweight champion of the world, the man who made Jim Jeffries take to the alfalfa. With the vaudevilles act and chasing of Tommy Burns over America and then into England, Johnson was left exhausted and inactive. In fact, he had been out of the ring for 7 months. In the summer of 1908, he stopped Ben Taylor in Plymouth, England, after 8 rounds, even though he spent much of the days leading up to the fight getting drunk. Burns then moved on to Australia, and once again Johnson would follow, but not before bumping into Australian promoter Hugh Huge Deal McIntosh, who made steps to arranging a Burns-Johnson fight by talking to several wealthy sports investors into helping him come up with the $30,000 Burns had demanded. Johnson was offered $5,000 for a fight in Sydney, Australia, and the chance to fight for the world title. Although Johnson was at first gobsmacked by the lowball offer, he was forced to accept. His manager, Sam Fitzpatrick, had already agreed for Johnson to fight Sam Langford in London, but with the offer to fight Burns now in place, he agreed with promoter and Langford manager Arthur Frederick, Peggy Bettington, that they would return with the world title and fight Sam after he had dealt with Burns. Bettington agreed to delay the fight and even paid for Johnson and Fitzpatrick to travel to Australia, with one condition, that Johnson sign a letter with the promise of coming back to London to fight Langford before heading back to America.
Oh, how great would that have been? Johnson Langford in London. Wow. Well, the big fight was set anyway for 20 rounds at Rushcutters Bay in Sydney on Boxing Day of 1908. Many American boxers were disappointed with Burns for actually taking the fight, and John L. Sullivan was one of them, who was quoted as saying, "Shame on the money-mad champion. Shame on the man who upsets good American presidents because there are dollars, 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 dollars in it." Well, 3 days before the Burns-Johnson fight, Jeffrey actually expressed his position about the possibility that a black man would hold the heavyweight title. He told reporters, and please excuse some of this obscenity here, but if that coon comes around here and challenges me to fight him, if he wins from Burns, I'll grab him by the neck and I'll run him out. When reporters asked Jeffries to explain what he meant by that, Jeffries declared that he was not willing to see the championship of the division go to a Negro. Rather than allow Johnson to carry off the belt, he will re-enter the ring and he will whip him. A day later, Jeffries withdrew this statement, obviously having a few too many drinks, announcing that if that big coon comes around me with his big talk about challenging me, I will take him by the neck and I will throw him into the street. The Washington Post clarified the previous meeting that Johnson and Jeffries had when he was champion, which you said earlier, Sean. It said Jeff actually ordered to get him into the cellar with Johnson, lock the door and let the best man walk out after the finished fight, but adheres to his determination to retire and would not fight a Negro even if he decided to fight again. Same old stuff coming from Jeffries, but on December 26, 1908, the flamboyant Johnson, who often taunted his opponents as he beat them soundly, got his chance against Tommy Burns. James J. Jeffries was originally offering to referee the fight for $5,000 plus travel expenses, but Johnson rightly and absolutely rejected him. So Hugh McIntosh, the promoter who had never refereed a boxing match before, agreed to oversee the first mixed contest for the heavyweight championship of the world.
Seconds after the first bell, Burns hit the canvas. Johnson had landed a huge right uppercut that flattened the champ. He managed to recover and fight on, while Johnson continued with his taunts and clinches and in between rounds. He mocked Burns from the start by saying, "Poor little Tommy, who told you you were a fighter?" And on the rare occasion when Burns managed to land a punch, Johnson laughed in his face and said, "Poor Tommy, who taught you to hit? Your mother?" Burns hit the canvas once in a one-sided beating, but Johnson could have ended it earlier, especially in the sixth when he had Burns staggering. Johnson lifted his opponent upright and helped him back to his corner after the bell sounded. Burns went down again in the seventh, but as the bell rang for the 14th round, Johnson rushed from his corner and landed a right hand that sent him down. He got up and Johnson knocked him down again. Previously, it had been arranged that if the police interfered, a decision would be rendered on points, and following that last knockdown, the police were signalled for the fight to be halted. One bulletin wrote that McIntosh shouted, in a voice fit to wake the dead, "Stop, Johnson!" McIntosh declared Jack Johnson the winner. One article explained the moment, and it reads, Johnson waved his hands to the crowd that did not cheer him. A few straggling voices were raised, but they were mere flecks of sound in an ocean of silence. Within minutes, the stadium was empty. There is video footage that did capture some of the fight and just as it was ending, but it was cut the moment before Burns hits the deck. Jack Johnson had now become the first black heavyweight champion of the world. Jack London, a boxing fan who was not shy about his racist preferences, was in Sydney, and he reported on the Burns-Johnson contest.
And Jack London wrote, "The fight, there was no fight. No American massacre could compare with the hopeless slaughter that took place in Sydney Stadium today. It was not a case of too much Johnson, but all Johnson. A golden smile tells the story, and a golden smile was Johnson's. The fight had all the seemings of a playful Ethiopian at loggerheads with a small and futile white man, or a grown man cuffing a naughty child, or a monologue of one Johnson who made a noise with his fists like a lullaby, tucking one Burns into the little crib in Sleepy Hollow, or a funeral with Burns for the late deceased, Johnson for Undertaker, Gravedigger, and Sexton. Chicago Daily Tribune's editorial for the day that followed the Burns-Johnson fight captured this headline: "New champion has yet to prove his class." The report went on to read, "The victory of Jack Johnson over Tommy Burns in Australia yesterday dethroned the white man with the place he appeared destined to hold on as long as the game of fisticuffs held its existence. The fact that the black defeated a white man points only too plainly the lack of class in the present-day crop of heavyweights. There has been and is talk of the Negro being as clever as Jim Corbett, the former champion, but the records fail to show where he did anything of note in the fighting line. There is talk of inducing Jeffries to return to the ring and meet Johnson for the title, despite the fact that he has seen his best days in ring service. Even so, the great majority of fans are of the opinion that he would beat the Negro. Immediately after Johnson's victory, Jeffries reiterated his objections to fight the new champion.
And Jeffries said, "I have stated and repeated 5,000 times within the last 10 days that I will not re-enter the ring for any inducement. I am not going to fight Johnson or any other Negro or any white man, big or little. When I retired, I retired. I have been out of training for 4 years, and I doubt if I could ever get back to my old condition. I do not like to see the highest honour of pugilism rest in the hands of a black man, but it is not my fault that it does, and it is not up to me to wrest the championship belt from the Negro. I advise Burns and other young fighters to draw the colour line and not to take on Johnson or Langford and thus endanger the championship." While James Corbett, the former champion who lost his title in 1897 and was already 42 years old, kept announcing in the press that he would fight Johnson to return the title to the white race, and in his words, if other whites are unavailable. A week after the Burns-Johnson fight, the Washington Post reported that Jim Jeffries received so many letters and telegrams from persons who wanted him to meet Jack Johnson in the ring that it looked as if he was being smoked out gradually. Jim Jeffries continued to maintain at the start of 1909 that he wanted no part of Johnson. He said, "There will be no fight between Jack Johnson and myself. I don't want the money. I am out of the game, and the public might as well understand it." Still, from the moment Johnson won the championship in Australia, he was on a collision course with the former champion Jim Jeffries. Johnson and Fitzpatrick ended their ties not long after the Burns win. George Little become Jack Johnson's new manager.
Yeah, and Fitzpatrick actually said that the championship had gone to Johnson's head. He was a different man before the fight. He would feed out of my hand then, but he is a hard man to handle now. Anyhow, he doesn't want a manager now. He's got Mrs. Johnson as his manager. So they said it was George, but George sort of was. He's on record. George Little was his manager. Now, when Johnson actually arrived in Grand Central Station in New York, he was greeted by many of his fans, predominantly black, but some curious whites as well. He enjoyed his time in the Big Apple on the stage for his 2-week engagement at Hammerstein's Victoria, but returned to Chicago looking for a good time. His point of call was the Levee District, a red light district, which was home to 500 saloons, whorehouses, 56 pool rooms, 50 gambling halls, 6 variety theatres, peep shows, of course opium dens back then, and cocaine parlours, as well as buffet flats, apparently, apartments that provided food and drink, piano music, and, of course, prostitutes. So he enjoyed himself afterwards. Now, while Johnson celebrated his victory in fashion, efforts to persuade Jim Jeffries to retrieve the honour of the white race began to increase dramatically, and that was quoted by one of the newspapers. Boxing historian Bert Sugar said Jack Johnson was a burr in the side of society. His win over Tommy Burns in 1908 was the worst thing that happened to the Caucasian race since Tamerlane. Here was Johnson flamboyantly doing everything, running around with white women, speeding his cars up and down the streets and occasionally crashing them. All of it contributed to find somebody to take him on. Jeffries must emerge from the alfalfa farm and remove that smile from Johnson's face. Now, of course, he hasn't fought Sam Langford at this point either, and Peggy Bettinson, who was still managing Sam Langford at the time, and who had obviously advanced Johnson and his manager funds to cover their expenses with the understanding that Johnson would fight Langford in London, released Johnson's agreement out into the public domain because, obviously, he hadn't heard anything from him.
And it read, "Gentlemen, I undertake and agree to carry out my contest with Sam Langford on the 22nd of February 1909 on the same terms and conditions as already arranged with Langford for a £1,000 purse and 1/3 of the interest in any bioscope pictures that may be taken. At the same time, allow me to tender my thanks to you for the courtesy you have extended to myself and my manager, Mr. Sam Fitzpatrick, whilst we have been in this country. Yours faithfully, J. Johnson." However, once Johnson won the world title, he said that he never signed the contract, as it was his manager that did it on behalf of him. There was even photographic evidence of Johnson's signature, but he refused to accept it. He had eyes set on bigger money fights like Jim Jeffries. Now on March the 1st, Jeffries passed through Omaha, Nebraska on a vaudeville tour and released the following statement: "I will arrange to meet Johnson as soon as my 20 weeks engagement is over. I feel obligated to the sporting public to at least make an effort to reclaim the heavyweight championship for the white race." I was through with the fighting game until Johnson butted in the first place, but so long as I've not been defeated, I think it no more than right that I should step into the ring once again and demonstrate that a white man is king of them all. The next day, Jeffries withdrew from this willingness to fight unless he got himself into a proper condition, and he told reporters, "I will fight Jack Johnson for the World Heavyweight Championship if I am able to get into condition to do myself justice." Jeffries added that the story from Omaha that I said I would fight Johnson as soon as I finished my vaudeville engagement is not true. I have never said definitely I would fight Johnson, and I am not ready to do so now.
That same month, Jeffries arrived in New York City on his vaudeville tour. A crowd of 5,000 fans was waiting for him, encouraging him to fight Johnson while blocking the streets around Grand Central Station. Johnson was in town, and he didn't waste an opportunity like this to tease Jeffries. And in an interview with the Associated Press, he said, "I am willing to meet Jeffries. I am willing to meet any man in the world, and I do not think anyone can get a decision over me, much less put me out." It tires me to hear this talk about Jeffries claiming the championship. While when a mayor leaves office, he's an ex-mayor, isn't he? When a champion leaves the ring, he's an ex-champion. Well, if Jeff wants to try and get the championship back, I'm willing to take him on. He's actually sent his lawyer to Jeffries with a message that was distributed to the press. And it said, "My client, John Johnson, the world's heavyweight champion, desires me to inform you that he will be glad to meet you at the office to complete arrangements for a contest between the champion and yourself." Jeffries received the invitation to meet Johnson at a courtroom in New York City, where he appeared to answer charges of violations of the New York State Penal Code prohibition on prize fighting. The New York law outlawed the law and the delivery of a challenge. Johnson's attorney either did not know the law or chose to bluntly ignore it at the courthouse, since he knew that his offer would be documented in all newspapers. Jeffries was actually careful and did not accept the invitation immediately. He explained his position to reporters. He said, "I am taking weight off rapidly. I am confident that I can get back into condition again, but until I do, I won't talk fight. If Johnson had been a white man, I would have never thought of fighting again. I would have stayed in retirement for the rest of my life."
On March 17, 1909, Jeffries' camp leaked a rumour that within a few days the former champion would announce his decision to re-enter the ring to fight Jack Johnson. The next day, Jeffries told a Washington Post correspondent that he would fight only if he received 75% of the purse. After a few days passed without a word from Jeffries, Johnson sent another publicised offer. $1,000 to say yes or no about the fight. Johnson wanted some certainty to plan his fight schedule. Jeffries declined the offer and could not make up his mind whether to take the fight with Johnson. The first black heavyweight champion then accepted the open invitation of the former champion James Corbett, giving Jeffries 2 weeks to change his mind. This ultimatum worked. On April 20th, Jeffries announced at the American Music Hall in New York City, "I will fight Jack Johnson. I will defend my title as undefeated heavyweight champion of the world." To the reporters at the scene, Jeffries handed out a written statement, which read, "I will say that I never felt better. I held off making the announcement until I became sure I was absolutely the same Jeffries as when I retired 4 years ago. I did so then after defeating every possible contender for the title. There was no one left for me to meet. The present heavyweight situation is the only thing that could have brought me out of retirement. I have all the money I will ever need, and there is no monetary consideration that could tempt me into the ring if I was not sure that I could easily defeat any challenger for the championship. As for Johnson, the tactics which he has employed, presumably to attempt to force a match, have been such that I felt I would only lower myself by replying until I felt I was prepared to say that I would fight."
That written statement continued. It said, "At the expiration of my vaudeville contract, which positively forbids my signing any contracts, pugilistic or otherwise, I will be ready to discuss terms for an unlimited round contest. All I will ask after that is sufficient time to thoroughly condition myself, and should Johnson care to challenge me for the title, I will do what I think I owe to the public. That is to defend my title of undefeated champion of the world." Now, while Jeffries began to get himself in shape and out of shape, Jack Johnson actually agreed to fight Stanley Ketchel on August the 16th, 1909 in San Francisco. In need of a few warm-up fights, Johnson actually made his first heavyweight title defence. It was bet harder than a warm-up fight against Philadelphia Jack O'Brien in Philadelphia on May 19. Johnson was not at his best and drew on a newspaper decision, although most felt that the champ edged it. He then went on to spend $4,800 of his $5,000 earnings within 2 days, buying himself a new fast car, his newfound love at the time, and Johnson said, "My mind is constantly on automobiles." After defeating Antonio Rosalino, a stocky Italian-American who fought under the name of Tony Ross, Johnson was actually involved in a car crash. He was actually left bleeding, but came away from the accident, unluckily for him, not seriously injured. However, one of the sporting girls he was with was. Johnson signed with Sonny Jim Koffroff for 2 fights in Colma, the big one with Ketchel in October, and a warm-up of sorts against Al Kaufman on September the 9th. He's now starting to fight the white guys that avoided him. Got the title. So the 10-round bout was won easily by Johnson, who actually toyed with Kaufman. When the bell sounded, the referee refused to hold up his hand as the winner. So it went down as a draw, but he did batter him. He won absolutely clearly and defended his title once again.
A well-known San Francisco sporting expert was asked how Jim Jeffries would do against Johnson, and his reply, "Jeffries will do well to stay in retirement." Johnson would probably leave the ring with his championship laurels. Johnson, in his battle with Kaufman, proved he is a master of the boxing game. There was never a time in the entire contest where the Californian had a chance. He was simply a chopping block for the champion. While Jim was getting in shape for his fight with Johnson, Jeffries declared, "Should Stanley Ketchel win against Johnson, I would discontinue training as the title would be where it rightfully belongs." Well, Johnson was now ready to face Stanley Ketchel, a fight that we have discussed in our Stanley Ketchel Darker Side of Boxing episode and in Jack Johnson's career profile. So please do listen to those episodes for more details on that specific fight. Now, reports do vary on whether the fix was on or off the table, but Johnson did agree to let Ketchel make a good showing for at least 12 of the rounds. The fight was pretty much how the Burns fight had gone, and Johnson was winning comfortably. But then midway through the 12th, Ketchel strayed from the script and tried to pull off the double cross. As Johnson sent yet another long lazy jab towards Ketchel's face, the middleweight champion lunged forward with an overhand right which put Johnson down. He caught himself with one hand and then sprang up again with a sheepish grin on his face. Johnson came right back and hit him in the mouth so hard with his right hand that the force of the blow sent both men to the floor. Ketchel stayed there, flat on his back. 4 of his teeth flew across the canvas. The crowd fell silent as the referee counted him out. Johnson stood, one arm along the top rope, the other on his hip, peering down anxiously for some sign that his opponent would revive. Of course he would, but it took him several minutes before Ketchel actually recovered his senses.
Brutal knockout. So with that victory, attentions quickly turned to Jack Johnson versus Jim Jeffries. And on the afternoon of October 29, 1909, in the banquet hall of New York's Albany Hotel on Broadway, Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries met face-to-face for the first time in 4 years. Once they both sat at the press conference table, Jeffries slapped $5,000 bet on the table. Johnson actually came out with $2,500, saying it was all I had in the world. They had previously agreed on a $5,000 side bet on the outcome of the fight. In the end, the bet was shelved, but they did agree for the winner to get a 75% of the winnings, the loser 25%, although that changed by fight time. The split would eventually become 60-40 to the winner. Well, Johnson and Jeffries actually signed the following articles of agreement that day, and we've got an actual breakdown of it. So, number one, part of this agreement was they agreed to box for the heavyweight championship of the world. Number two, they agreed to box before the club, organised, or person offering the best financial inducement. Bids for the contest must be submitted on December the 1st, 1909 by 3 p.m. at the Hotel Albany, New York City. Each club, organisation or person making a bid for this contest must have a representative on the ground who will post $5,000 in coin or certified cheque to make good of any or all stipulations of his bid. The referee is to be selected when the club bid is accepted. It is hereby agreed that the contest shall be of 45 rounds or more. The purse shall be divided 75% to the winner and 25% to the loser. Each of the contestants herewith posts with Robert P. Murphy of the New York as temporary stakeholder of a sum of $10,000. Of this sum, each posts $5,000 as a wager or side bet on the result of the contest and $5,000 as a forfeit to guarantee compliance with these articles.
Number 9, the contest shall take place no later than July 5th, 1910. It is hereby understood and agreed that the contest shall be fought under straight Marquis of Queensberry rules and with 5-ounce gloves. And the final condition is that the final stake and forfeit hour is to be decided upon when the club is selected. Witness our hands and seals this 29th day of October 1909. Signed, James J. Jeffries and John Arthur Johnson. Now, with 9 months until the fight, Johnson continued with his normal affairs, with women and playing a vaudeville at a theatre in Pittsburgh. Tex Rickard stopped in Pittsburgh to see if he could persuade Johnson into an agreement prior to the bid meeting. He located the boarding house where Johnson and his girlfriend, Belle Schreiber, were staying during his engagement. Johnson wasn't at home, but Belle was willing to meet him. When Rickard asked her about what she would most like from the impending deal, her response was, a seal skin coat. Tex told her, I'll buy you the best seal skin coat I can find if you get Jack to sign. Tex Rickard then left Pittsburgh and travelled on to New York. Before the bid time arrived, he met Johnson and Bell in a club in Harlem to talk business. Just as he had promised, Rickard presented her with a $1,000 seal skin coat. Rickard then offered Johnson $2,500 to sign with him, but what Johnson actually wanted, in addition to the money, was to be guaranteed a fair and honest deal. Rickard, of course, who we've done a career profile on, was the man with the reputation as a straight shooter and who could give Johnson this assurance. Rickard's handshake on this was as good as a signed contract. Without even talking with George Little, Johnson signed up. Rickard then discovered that a promoter named Jack Gleason had made a similar secret arrangement with Jeffries and had already accepted a signing bonus of $10,000.
So that was twice the sum Rickard had promised Johnson. So to keep his scheme afloat, Rickard agreed to become Gleason's partner and pledged a second $5,000 bonus for Johnson so that both fighters were treated equally. Rickard understood that the real reason, as with all boxers, was not because Jeffries and Johnson wanted to settle any racial scores. It was quite simply because they both wanted, loved and needed money. The day came for the bids to be submitted. Each had to be put into a sealed envelope and presented to the fighters with a certified cheque for $5,000. Rickard had been convinced by a wealthy mine investor, who was Thomas Cole, to actually enter the bid as a partner with him. And through the grapevine, Tex Rickard also knew that the bids for the fight would be somewhere between the region of $75,000 and $100,000. Johnson then gave Rickard some inside information that promoters were actually going to bid as high as $100,000 to the top of that range to get the fight, an amount 3 times what had ever been offered for a purse. Now, Johnson assured Rickard that a bid of $101,000 would give him the winning bid. On a side story, and according to the United Press agent, Johnson had been entertaining his friends at the Harlem Club, actually acting like a millionaire, when he actually confided in Rickard. He said, "Look here, Mr. Tex, I needs dough." The news reporter tried to actually capture the dialect as he tried to listen in, and insisted that Rickard pulled out a wad of bills and gave Johnson $2,500 without even battering an eyelid. Johnson supposedly said, "I likes the way you doing business. We is playing ball together." So Tex obviously used his wealth to get Johnson on side. And at a point should also be made that without the Johnson-Jeffries fight, there would have been no Tex Rickard, something we never quite mentioned before, and more than likely no $1 million gates in the future. In that, he was not in the money at this moment in time. Tex Rickard was not anticipated to be among those bidding either for this boxing event of a lifetime.
But to the dismay of the top promoters of the day, the cowboy, as New York reporters called him, would ride back into the picture at the 11th hour after receiving that financial backing and root of confidence from his Minnesota friend and wealthy mine investor, Thomas Cole. So back to the day of the purse bids, and there was a total of 5 offers presented in New York. The key figures in the deal included Tex Rickard, Jack Gleason, Ed Graney, Tom McCary of Los Angeles, P.T. King, representing Hugh McIntosh of Australia, Jack Johnson and his manager George Little of Chicago, and Jim Jeffries' manager Sam Berger of Los Angeles. Jim Jeffries did not appear. The bidders sat around a large table. The first envelope opened was Ed Graney's. As president of the Tuxedo Club of San Francisco, he made 3 offers. The first presented the fighters with 80% of the gross gate receipts with a $75,000 guarantee and an additional 100% of the movie rights. Graney's second offer gave the fighters 80% of the gross gate receipts with a $70,000 guarantee and $20,000 of income from the movies. The third offer gave the fighters 90% of the gate, absent a guarantee, and 100% of the film rights. The second bid then came from partners James J. Koffroff, president of Tijuana Jockey Club, and Jack Gleason of San Francisco. The duo made 3 offers. The first would give the fighters $125,000 with the agreement that the Jockey Club would retain 100% of the film rights. The second offer they put in would give the fighters $75,000 and 66.5% of the film revenue with a $20,000 bid acceptance bonus. The third offer gave the fighters 80% of the gross gate revenue and 66.75% of the film revenue.
And in what was in a strange twist, Jack Gleason was also partnered with Tex Rickard, as we said, and he was also partnered with someone else. When their envelope was open, out came 15 $1,000 bills and a cheque for $5,000. It was as if Rickard was sitting on the head of the high-stakes card game, throwing down $2,000 chips at the Northern Saloon that he used to own. The bid offered the fighters $101,000 guarantee. His bid also included 70% of the film revenues with the following incentives. $20,000 of the guarantee to be paid immediately, no promise, but fact. The bills and the cheque were already on the table. $30,000 in 30 days, and the balance 48 days prior to the fight. Tom Carney's bid, representing the Pacific Club of Los Angeles, was the fourth to be opened, and he presented two offers. The first was 100% of the gate receipts and 50% of the movie profits. The second was $110,000 guarantee and 50% of the movie profits, with the stipulation that the club had absolute management of the pictures. Hugh McIntosh sent his bid by cable, and he was represented, as we mentioned earlier, in New York by P.T. King. His first offer was to pay the fighter $37,000 if the fight were held in America, $40,000 to each if it was held in England or France, and $50,000 if held in Australia, with McIntosh getting all movie profits. His second offer was to give the fighters 100% of the gate, less $10,000, and an additional $10,000 to the fighters in the way of movie profits. Rickard had played an absolute blinder in the form of the actual $1,000 bills. He had stimulated that same effect with his $30,000 purse stacked in $20 gold pieces in the window of the Cook Bank in Goldfield 4 years earlier in the Joe Gans and Battling Nelson fight. Check out Joe Gans' career profile if you ain't, with great information on that fight. But Jack Johnson was champion. He had the primary authority to make the decision of which bid to accept. Jeffries' manager went along with Johnson's decision.
While historians have said that Johnson stopped the bid process to say, "Stop everything, this party is over, I'm fighting for Mr. Tex," it is highly unlikely that he actually said it in those words. There were two more bidders to follow Rickard, and others at the meeting reported Johnson as saying that all of the promoters looked good to him and that he regarded them as responsible men. But faced with so many different kinds of bid possibilities, he suggested that the fighters be given 24 hours to consider the offers. Everyone agreed. That night, Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson were both at Madison Square Garden, but appearing in different rooms. Both gave interesting exhibitions. Jeffries was exercising and sparring with his manager Benson, and Johnson was having fun with sparring partners Monty Cutler and Jack Heinen and Joe Murray in the ring. The next day, in a meeting that excluded the media, Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries' manager selected Rickard and Gleason's proposal. While it wasn't the highest bid, Rickard had knocked them Bambi and had won the bid. Before the fight, as early as January of 1910, Tex Rickard and Jim Jeffries sold their shares of the fight pictures for $190,000, Jeffries to receive 2/3 and Rickard 1/3 of the amount, to W.T. Rock, representing an Eastern syndicate. The papers reported that Jack Johnson had already sold his share to a Western syndicate for $50,000. The ones left holding the fight pictures would lose money when the government actually outlawed the transporting of the films across state lines after the fight, which, of course, we will go into during the aftermath of this tale. It was actually a law that stood for 2 decades and was supposed to hurt just Johnson, but it backfired and it hurt many others, including Jack Dempsey, who estimated that he lost $2 million in income during the time he held the title and could have made much more money from the film of his fights.
And in May 1910, Harper's Weekly published an article examining the finance and economics of the fight. It said, "No longer are ring heroes addressed as human thunderbolt and the fighting cyclone. Instead, we read of Jeffries as the hope of the white race and Johnson as the Negro's deliverer. When pugilists, no matter what their size or ability may be, are thus introduced to the public, it is but a step to billionaire battlers." But Harper's considered the possibility that racism would also hurt the box office receipts through some forms of censorship, and they rightly predicted this. He basically said that since there is objection to Johnson's colour in the South, however, the moving pictures receipts will not be so large. If the word of the Kentucky Colonels Association is to be accepted, no offence intended, the films will not be shown south of Baltimore. In fact, the syndicate has stated that they will not be worth more than $50,000 at most. This is a serious handicap to Johnson. His brethren believe that he will rise superior to mere momentary influences and, to use a Virginia popular expression, bring home the bacon. 1 month before the fight, everything seemed to be progressing smoothly in San Francisco, where it's due to take place. W.W. Norton, sports editor of the San Francisco Examiner, described the activities in a full-page account. Jim Jeffries' outdoor boxing ring in his training camp at Roardine had been built to match exactly the one being built by Tex Rickard for the match. Jeffries' ring was padded to the same degree as the one for the big fight and sprinkled with rosin dust for each performance. It was reported that at this point, Big Jim was in excellent condition and was sparring with Jim Corbett, Bob Armstrong and Joe Chiniski. Jack Johnson's camp was at the Seal Beach Hotel, and his training regime included taking on all comers.
Al Kaufman, who was preparing for a match with Sam Langford in June, was brought in for sparring, and perhaps one of the more interesting comments of the pre-fight period came from the man who planned to be in Johnson's corner as his chief second, the veteran Billy Delaney. Joe Gans was scheduled to be Johnson's chief second, but he was in the final stages of a terminal case of tuberculosis, so Delaney stepped in to replace him. Please do go back and listen to the Joe Gans career profile. Now, as the fight approached, many indicated that the fight would be a fix. Even John L. Sullivan himself told the New York Times the bout was likely to be a frame-up. And California's governor, J.N. Gillette, agreed. This Jeffries-Johnson fight is simply a scheme to make a lot of money out of the credulity of the public. Then, the venue to stage the bout in San Francisco was plunged into jeopardy when the governor of California, James Norris Gillette, decided he would not permit the fight to take place in his state on July 4th. Initially, it was the Methodist Preachers Association of Philadelphia that began a requested boycott when they declared that this fight can be regarded as nothing less than a national disgrace and a calamity to the moral life of our people, and appealed to President Taft to intervene and stop the fight from happening. But Reverend Reverdy Ransom, an activist, AME pastor from New York, countered their appeals when perfectly saying, "Is a prize fight more revolting and atrocious than those lynchings and burnings which are of much too frequent occurrence?" In the end, James Norris Gillette, who apparently assumed the fight was just an exhibition, officially barred the fight from his state, ordering his Attorney General to tell Rickard to get out of my state, tell him to take Johnson and Jeffries with him. What he is planning is a prize fight, and it's against the law.
Get that far and all of a sudden it's against the law. It's ridiculous. So this was bad news for Rickard, obviously, who had already paid $35,000 in construction costs on the San Francisco arena. California Attorney General Ulysses Webb filed a motion for a permanent injunction against the Jeffries-Johnson fight and an application for a temporary restraining order against the Kaufman-Langford contest in the state Superior Court. When informed of the actions of the Attorney General, Rickard actually fired back that he would move the fight to a different state. That same day, Governor William Spry of Utah said he would not hold the fight in his state. Rickard moved quickly and identified Nevada, the most open-minded state in America. He met with Governor Denver S. Dickerson, who had only one question for Tex. "Just tell me, man to man, it's on the level, Tex." And Rickard promised. It will be the squarest fight ever pulled off. With that, the fight was immediately transferred to Nevada. Reno was actually chosen over Goldfield due to its better transport links by train and boat. However, Tex estimated that he had already lost $70,000 worth of tickets for a California event. With less than a month to go, the location of the fight was changed. He refunded all the money of the tickets, salvaged the building materials, and shipped them to Reno. There were a number of theories circulating at the time among reporters as to who really jinxed the San Francisco deal. Tex Rickard thought it was a retaliation from Kofroff, who felt double-crossed in New York at the bidding, but more likely than anything it was literally just down to religious grounds. Approximately 3 weeks before the match on June 8, 1910, the leading magazine of the Moving Picture Exhibitors Association published its prediction about the box office prospects of the Johnson-Jeffries fight film. It said it is no exaggeration to say that the entire world will await a pictorial of the fight. With the unmistakable victory of Jeffries, these pictures should prove in the current locution a gold mine.
The magazine continued to say, "This is the wish that is father of the thoughts of hundreds of millions of white people throughout the world. But if Johnson wins, it is commonly believed that the pictures will then be of comparatively little value, especially among the white section of the community." After dealing with the venue issue, next was the referee. When no agreement could be reached on who should be the man in the middle, Rickard nominated himself, the task which would be his first and last professional fight that he would ever referee. Johnson was convinced that he would be fair, just like Hugh McIntosh was in his fight against Tommy Burns. Not long before the Jeffries fight, Johnson and Little parted ways. Johnson said that his manager was trying to get him to take a dive because the money would be better for all concerned. Little said he was being forced out, with Sig Hart being positioned to take his place. Whatever the reason, they severed ties completely after an altercation at a hotel when Johnson kicked Little out. Little told the press, "I am no Sam Fitzpatrick. He can't do this to me. I will manage Johnson, or there will be no fight." He did have a contract entitling him to a quarter of the champion's earnings and demanded that he be paid back the $10,000 he said he had put up as a forfeit. He was also spotted walking up and down Market Street, and Johnson recalled, showing his pistol to everybody and shouting that I'd robbed him. When I learned of this, I got my car and drove there, intending to punch him in the nose. The police kept them apart, and after a quick legal battle, Johnson sacked Little legitimately and hired veteran trainer Tom Flanagan to oversee any business matters.
Little finally accepted defeat and probably the possibility of getting punched on the nose as well, and reportedly bet against Jack Johnson. So there was a story that while Johnson was actually doing his road work, Sam Langford, this wasn't just a one-off, but apparently before this fight as well, he would drive down the road in front of Johnson as he's running and just raise up the dust from his car so it would blow into Johnson's face. Langford obviously wanting to get this title shot, he even offered his services as a sparring partner to Jeffries and went on record to say that he would never face Big Jim because he didn't want to have to beat him. None of this bothered Johnson, but rumours did surface years later that Jeffries had accepted Sam's offer to spar, and apparently Sam knocked him out. Some even suggest that it was a secret fight and Sam dominated Jeffries, putting him down a few times. Well, on June 25th, 1910, the White Slave Traffic Act, also called the Mann Act, was introduced. It was a United States federal law that was meant to combat forced prostitution and sin, or for any other immoral purposes. So because it lacked specificity, it criminalised many who were not participating in prostitution. It became a way to persecute large numbers of unmarried couples participating in premarital or extramaterial activities, especially when it involved crossing state lines. Well, this act will, of course, become an issue for Jack Johnson, but not for another 2 years or so. So the excitement of the fight was now growing day by day and being printed in every newspaper across the country and beyond. And author Rex Beach arrived in Reno and he wrote about the size of this fight. He said, "We are obsessed by the magnitude of this coming clash. We see, we hear, we talk, nothing else. Monday, 150,000 words went out from here over the wires, and the fight was a week away. And every day it is the same. From now on until the time of the battle, the daily number will increase.
A New York Times editorial summed up a common view. If the black man wins, thousands and thousands of his ignorant brothers will misinterpret his victory as justifying claims to much more than physical equality with their white neighbours. Jeffries, now 35, was misguided and uneducatedly said, "I am going into this fight for the sole purpose of proving that a white man is better than a Negro." In his 1954 study, The Negro in American Life and Thought, Rayford Logan characterised the decades before the turn of the century as the nadir, meaning depths of despair for African Americans. The historian David Leverin Lewis, and winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, agreed with Rayford Logan, and he said, "It was a time of especially brutal relations between the races. By 1905, segregation has been poured in concrete, as it were. Blacks can't ride buses, go to vaudeville shows or the cinema unless they are sat in the crow's nest. Blacks and whites begin to live parallel lives, although not on an even plane." David Remnick, a Muhammad Ali biographer, wrote in the London Guardian's Observer Sport Monthly in 2003, "With the rise of modern heavyweight champions, race was at the centre of nearly every important heavyweight drama. First came John L. Sullivan, who refused to cross the colour line and face a black challenger, i.e. Peter Jackson. Then came Jim Jeffries, who swore he would retire when there are no white men left to fight. Jeffries seemed to have the support of all of white America. The editors of Collier's magazine wrote that Jeffries would surely win because the white man, after all, has 30 centuries of traditions behind him, all the supreme efforts, the inventions and the conquests, and whether he knows it or not, Bunker Hill and Thermopylae and Hastings and Agincourt."
In the days leading up to the bout, Johnson had an open door to all reporters and fans and played up to the crowds. He impressed Governor Dickerson, who said, "I have never seen a man who can whip Jack Johnson as he stands today, and I am forced to bet on him." When John L. Sullivan asked Johnson what kind of shape he was in, he answered, "Captain John, if I felt any better, I'd be afraid of myself." He actually trained in Rick's Roadhouse. Now, in the parlour, he had a piano player, he had a violinist who entertained the drunks with popular music, accompanying 2 roulette tables. People everywhere moved freely throughout the rooms, the porches, and even upstairs to his private quarters. Whenever Johnson came downstairs and wherever he went, servants surrounded him. One night, Johnson was actually playing roulette with a book tucked under his arm. When he was asked by reporters what it was, he told them it was his bedtime reading and gave the title as The History of the Warfare of Modern Science and Virology, demonstrating his intellect. Jeffries, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, and he kept everything private. He was angry, and from the time he appeared at his training headquarters until he entered the ring, he was just constantly moody. He hated performing for the crowds, which he even refused to do as a training camp in Mona Springs, which disappointed his fans. While his quarters were accessible to the crowds, he simply did not want to shake hands, sign autographs, or perform. Certain reporters did have some daily access. Jack London and Rex Beach were among those who did. Jack London said, "Jeff does not care a red cent for the public. In his way, he is an iron man, simple and quiet and reposeful, and not gregarious in a wide way."
Jack London continued and he said, "He feels no impulse to be a hail fellow, well met with Tom, Dick and Harry, and he is honest enough not to stimulate a feeling he does not possess. All the same, it is darn hard on the public." London simply explained that Jeffries was a silent type, but Rex Beach commented, "He has the disposition of a tarantula. He's got a diabolical gift of second sight. He can smell a spectator for a mile, and he seems to know just when we won't be there." Rex Beach gave his opinion on both fighters, and what I'm about to read out is what he wrote on Jeffries. And by the sounds of it, and we'll let you be the judge of it, I think he had more than just a soft spot for the former champion. And this is what it reads: "His cheeks are sunken, but it is the gauntness of vigorous health, and they shine with ruddy colour. His muscles are firm and pillant, and they are tanned to that perfect brown, which comes only from a life beneath smiling skies. He is younger than the camera shows, and no clicking shutter can snap the vigour that seems to lie in his massive hairy frame. In build, he is more like a wrestler than a fighter, and at first sight, one refuses to credit the stories of his quickness. But it is there, and with it all is a certain irresistible power that is hard to describe. His arms are huge, and, in his blows, there appears to be the same heavyweight that is in the thrust of a steamboat's walking beam. That is what impresses one most strongly, the tremendous weight that lurks behind his blows. Rex Beach assessed the abilities of Johnson, quite simply saying, "In the afternoon, I watched Johnson work, and it was very different. He has the soul of a joyrider."
He does continue. He says, "Nature designed him for a chauffeur, and while he is the master of the greatest defensive system any fighter of his weight has been equipped with, he seems to look upon his battle as a joke. I believe he knows of 50 good and sufficient reasons why he will beat his opponent next Monday. I doubt if the other possibility has ever appealed to him. He is fast, marvellously fast. Jeffries cannot approach the swiftness of his arms and hands. He has a straight left that taxes the eye to follow, but it seems that most of his ability and superlative cunning is exercised in self-protection." Now, interesting views there from Rex Beach. 2 days before the Johnson-Jeffries fight, the Wisconsin Christian Endeavor Society tried to prevent the exhibition of the fight film in Wisconsin. Now, the resolution was justified by the Christian Endeavor's traditional view that considered the manly act as a distinctly beastly act. A central figure in the anti-prize fight film movement was Wilbur Fisk's Crafts, a self-proclaimed Christian figure in the anti-prize fight film movement, a self-proclaimed Christian activist. In 1897, during the first public debate over the exhibition of fight films, Crafts was already active in Washington, and he was lobbying for federal laws to criminalize interstate transportation of fight films and information about fights as well. Crafts actually in 1897 campaign did not result in a federal legalization, but it contributed to the public opinion on the subject, so it sort of came about once again. Ultimately, only Maine, Iowa and Los Angeles banned fight films in response to the film exhibition of the March 1897 heavyweight championship fight between James Colbert and Bob Fitzsimmons. In 1910, Crafts and the Christian body were better prepared, but acknowledged that they lacked the political capital needed to prevent the Johnson-Jeffries fight. That did not stop them from using their influence to secure federal, state and public laws that would ban the exhibition of the fight film.
Their representative, Walter Smith of Iowa, introduced a pair of bills intended to limit the financial viability of the prize fight industry. The first bill was a federal censorship law that banned the interstate transportation of fight films and content products that describe prize fights. The second bill aimed at strengthening anti-gambling laws by imposing liability on the communication of bets, odds or lottery, and by criminalising a large set of activities relating to gambling. In a congressional hearing, Representative Smith stated to the record that his federal censorship bill was introduced just before the Jeffries-Johnson fight, and I confess was introduced partly in contemplation of that, and with a view to suppressing the pictures of that fight. The federal bills were not passed in 1910, but the Christian movement scored many other statutory victories during the summer of 1910. Crafts pressed and even threatened local politicians, arguing that, where the mayors have not expressed themselves on the prize fight pictures, it will be urged that he can be suppressed or removed by law on grounds that where the fight itself is forbidden, a vivid representation of it is also illegal. Crafts had behind him the support of 4 million members of the United Society of Christian Endeavor and other Christian groups. the United Society of Christian Endeavour pressed politicians across the country to ban the Johnson-Jeffries fight film by raising a wide range of moral arguments, including condemning the fight itself to focusing on the harm it could cause if children and women would be allowed to watch the moving pictures. Their rally cry was picking up momentum, but the movement of the fight film after the bout would depend only on its outcome. If Jeffries won, they would be distributed throughout America, but if Johnson won, they would be locked in a vault and never be given the light of day again. Of course, we will come to that towards the end of the show.
Doing picket lines outside, it was crazy. Well, Tex Rickard, he let his fears about Johnson's driving, a crazy driving that was, been known to his trainer, Delaney. Rickard had heard that Johnson had called one of the San Francisco newspapers the day before the fight and wanted them to send an automobile out to the camp so he could have a joyride. Well, Rickard wanted Delaney to take away Johnson's automobile privileges, clearly worried that he would have a crash and stop the fight. And with everything that's going on, it would have been absolute liberty, to be fair. But Delaney, he would not budge on not allowing Johnson to do what he wanted to do and what he liked. And with that, Johnson took off in a cloud of dust. Delaney looked at Rickard and explained that Johnson needed his diversion. But thankfully, he didn't have a crash. But Tex did not want his fight to go tits up, clearly. But everything he had done to keep it on as well, it would have been an absolute liberty. It really would have been. But it didn't crash, and I can understand where it was coming from. But on the morning of the fight, 13 specially arranged trains pulled into Reno, Nevada. Aboard were thousands of white men who had travelled all around the country to watch a fight like no other before it. They had come to see their hero, Jim Jeffries, take back the title from Jack Johnson, and the Chicago Tribune wrote, "It was going to be a contest between the white man's hope and the black peril." Jack Johnson said, "I'll win in the first round with one punch if possible." He also said, "I will bring home the bacon. I'll wear him down." On the day before the fight, Johnson was doing road work with his crew when Jeffries motored past him. Johnson shouted out, "Hello there, Jeff." Apparently Jeffries just grunted back. He was angry, frustrated and anxious. But both fighters released their customary statements to the press, and both were of course convinced that their gloves would be raised in victory in the end. And they're quite lengthy, but let's read them. Jack Johnson, this is what he said. He said, "When I go into the ring on the 4th of July to fight Mr. Jeffries, I will do so with full confidence that I am able to defeat him at the game of give and take."
Johnson continued and said, "I honestly believe that in pugilism, I am Jeffries' master, and it is my purpose to demonstrate this in the most decisive way possible. I think that I know Jeffries thoroughly as a fighter, and with this knowledge reassuring me, I am more than willing to defend the title of champion against him. I have trained faithfully for this fight. There cannot be the slightest doubt that my physical condition is such that it could not be improved upon. In this fight, more than in any other, it is impossible to tell in detail just how things will go. I am going to win. I will be there fighting at every turn. I don't overlook the tight pinches because I think my superiority over Mr. Jeffries eliminates the need of any thought of such things. There will be no lagging. The fight, in all probability, will be fast through every round, no matter how far it goes. I am prepared for a long contest if the fight is not quickly ended. And it goes without saying that such a short fight would be right under my hands. Every fighter on the eve of his fight declares that he hopes the best man wins. I am quite sincere when I say that I do. If Mr. Jeffries knocks me out or gains a decision over me, I will go to his corner and congratulate him just as soon as I am able. My congratulations will be no fake. I will mean it. If Mr. Jeffries has it in him to defeat me, I think I can modestly say he is entitled to all the congratulations he may receive. Let me say in conclusion that I believe that the meeting between Mr. Jeffries and myself will be a great test of strength, skill and endurance. The tap of the gong will be music to me."
And James J. Jeffries, this is what he had to say before the fight. He said, "When the gloves are knotted on my hands tomorrow afternoon and I stand ready to defend what is really my title, it will be at the request of the public which forced me out of retirement. I realise full well just what depends on me, and I am not going to disappoint. As to my condition and just how I feel on the eve of the battle, there's no use going into detail. That portion of the white race which has been looking to me to defend its athletic supremacy may feel assured that I am fit to do my very best. I want those who fancy my chances to know this much. If I had as much as a slight pain, a sore finger, or the most trivial thing imaginable that might annoy me, I would immediately insist on a postponement. Fortunately, I am sound as a dollar. I think I will surely beat Johnson. I would not have signed to fight at all unless I was reasonably certain of victory. It is impossible for me to say just how I will fight this coloured man. My method of attack will develop as the actual scrapping is on. Neither can I say whether the bout will be a long or a short one. Suffice it to say that any time I hit that other fellow, I'm going to hurt him, and that I will win just as quickly as I can. Well, 4 years after the Goldfield bout, on July 4th, 1910, the second of Tex Rickard's promotions, and this was the second fight to be called the greatest fight of the century. The notorious Great White Hope bout between the first black heavyweight champion Jack Johnson and the former champion Jim Jeffries would make both boxers very wealthy beyond their wildest dreams when they fought in the ring in Reno, Nevada.
The drama and excitement of the contest of black versus white, first created in the Goldfield fight between Gans and Nelson, was brought to a fever pitch by the Reno fight. Rickard's promotion of the fight between Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson would earn more money than any prior sporting event and create such a backlash before it was over in terms of racial conflicts that even the super resilient Tex would need a long respite from the labour and controversy of the prize fighting business. This was a champion versus a champion fight, and Bert Sugar explained that there was a theory by many that Jeffries was still the heavyweight champion. He had not lost his title in the ring, which was the expected rule. He still was, in their mind's eye, even nearly 6 years later, the champion of the world. Now, Johnson, in his eyes, was the only champion, and as Johnston read out earlier, Jack Johnson said this again in the lead-up to the fight when he said, "It amuses me to hear this talk of Jeffries claiming the championship. When a mayor leaves office, he's an ex-mayor. When a champion leaves the ring, he's an ex-champion." Now, the fight was initially billed in the newspapers as the Battle of the Century, but would become known as the Fight of the Century or the Johnson-Jeffries prize fight. Now, irrespective of its name, this was a battle of races. As thousands piled into the makeshift stadium, Johnson became concerned that he might get attacked by the predominantly white spectators, so he asked Jeffries himself to issue an appeal to his fans to remain calm whatever took place in the ring. Jim Jeffries obliged, and he said, "I would consider any move to intimidate Johnson as cowardly and a disgrace to the American spirit of fair play. I expect to whip him and then shake his hand. If Johnson should by any chance win, though, he must not be harmed. I demand this."
Well, very surprisingly, the betting favourite at 10-6, although it sort of fluctuated, but it was always Jim Jeffries at 35, with Johnson at 32, the underdog. But Big Jim already knew he stood no chance, as was written by Bert Sugar. He wrote that when the fight moved from California to Nevada, the arrangement that Jeffries would win was called off. Johnson had sent him word that he was no longer bound by the secret pre-fight agreement to go in the tank. Now it was best man wins, and Jeff knew before he entered the ring that Johnson was the best man. Jeffries actually recalled arriving at the arena. He said, going to the arena when the waiting was all over, "I remember being with people and taking a long ride in a good deal of dust. I remember seeing the big plank bowl and the crowd around it. There was a lot of yelling. I suppose there was a mob waiting to watch me go in, but I didn't know what all the yelling was about. I was in a fog." Now, although the fight was illegal across America, there was huge interest in the bout. So 30,000 New Yorkers gathered in Times Square, where giant bulletin boards had been set up on three sides of the New York Times building to provide details as soon as they started coming in from ringside. The San Francisco Examiner set up a ring high above the street and hired two boxers, obviously one black and one white, to reenact the whole fight, punch by punch, for the thousands who were watching below. And in Chicago, 5,000 black men and women anxiously took their seats at the Pekin, the most elegant black-owned theatre in the country. Among the 15,760 fans in attendance that night were many of the sport's biggest stars, promoters and managers. As was Tex Rickard's motto, all five former heavyweight champions were displayed in the ring before the fight.
They were introduced by the booming voice of Billy Jordan, a celebrity boxing announcer. They were John L. Sullivan, Ruby Bob Fitzsimmons, Gentleman Jim Corbett, Marvin Hart and Tommy Burns. Many champions in the other divisions were also introduced. Hugh McIntosh, Stanley Ketchel, Tom McCary and Jim Coffroth, Bill Lang, Sam Langford, battling Nelson, Philadelphia, Jack O'Brien, and many more also sat ringside. So many that when they stood in line for cameras, they stretched from one side of the ring to the other. After a long delay, Jack Johnson made his way to the ring about 2:30, wearing a black and white silk bathrobe. Of course he was booed, but he said that he was also amazed at the number of well-wishers I had. He said he heard many cheers. That's more than what took place in Australia, where my entry brought lusty boos and hisses. Moments before the fight, his cornermen watched Jim weep in the dressing room. Jeffries then made his way to the ring with Jim Corbett leading him out. The crowd in attendance all stood and applauded and cheered their hero. Even Johnson joined in with the clapping while he waited in the ring. Jack London captured both men's demeanour perfectly when he wrote, "Johnson, unaffected, joked with his seconds. The man of summer temperament smiled and smiled, while the man of iron, the grizzly giant, was grim and serious." Jeffries came into the ring at 227 pounds after training more than a year to lose 100 pounds, yet he still weighed 20 pounds more than Johnson, who came in at 208 pounds. By the time of the opening bell, he was a mountain of muscle, and he made the strong Johnson seem thin by comparison. In the ring, Tex told the fighters, "Now fellas, I didn't want to referee this fight, but seeing as you can't agree on anyone else, I guess it will have to be me."
Yeah, so Tex continued, he said, "Now I don't know much about this refereeing job, except that I want to give the crowd what they paid for, break clean and come out fighting at the bell." Now, Tex could actually not convince Jeffries or his camp to begin the fight with the customary handshake. In addition, Jeffries would not allow any pre-fight photos. The lack of sportsmanlike handshake between the two contestants did not sit well with the reporters or the spectators, who expected the professionals to put the game above the professional hostilities. Such was the tradition of boxing that while the entire well-being of the country rested on the racial outcome of this match, spectators still expected a friendly handshake at the beginning. Tex Rickard, in a striped shirt and a straw hat, circled the fighters at a radius of approximately 5 feet apparently, as referee Rickard took a hands-off approach and never stepped between the fighters until the end. Although Rickard was not known for his boxing expertise, he had the best vantage point of any of the witnesses and would later demonstrate what his knowledge of boxing was better than anyone who actually gave him credit for. So we're going to go into the fight now. And Jeffries, well, he had a strategy to rush and whack and destroy his opponent's strength by overpowering them with his own strength and forceful punches. After testing a variety of punches in his bag of tricks during the first few rounds, Jeffries knew the fight would be a very difficult task. Later, Tex actually told his wife, a few years later, that as he moved around the fighters, he saw the haggard lines in Jeffries' face. There was a strange indecision in the man's movements. Above the rumble of the crowd, Tex heard a voice offering 10-6 on Jeffries, and he thought that loud voice better was bound to lose his money. Johnson said to Jeffries in the second round, while hitting the big man again and again, "Don't rush, Jim. I can do this all afternoon."
Johnson recalled that the opening round made him sure he would get the victory. He said, "I was feeling quite fresh and going easily, able to hit him when I wanted to, and I could tell he wasn't going to beat me for strength." Johnson had his own strategy. Let the man wear himself out. Throw the force of his own weight on Jeffries' left shoulder and arm in the clinches so as to weaken his powerful left jab and engage, unnerve and demoralise him through ring chat. No smack, no profanity, just quick and witty one-liners. While in the clinch, he would talk to the crowd and Jeffries and say things like, "Come on now, Mr. Jeff, let me see what you've got. Do something, man. This is for the championship." Johnson resisted Jeffries' rushes, matched his power in the clinches and began to utilise his psychological warfare when he engaged Jeffries. When Johnson's big smile cracked his concentration and forced a smile on Jeffries' face, Johnson thought, mission accomplished. Johnson used his strength, boxing ability and psychological warfare on the old champion. The century-old fight film is evidence of a mismatch. The champ snapped in quick left jabs and sharp right uppercuts as he cut Jeffries' face into ribbons. At the end of the fourth round, Johnson scored with a looping right over the top of Jeffries' guard. Jeffries looked a beaten fighter right from that moment as he walked miserably back to his corner after the round. Johnson was already outclassing the Great White Hope, and the only evidence of Johnson's quick, powerful uppercuts is the manner in which Jeffries' head was pinged back repeatedly, up and backwards. Rex Beach had speculated, regarding their actual 18-carat fighting quality when it comes to the crucial test, nothing can be proven until the fateful fourth for both men are holding back.
Rex Beats continued, he said, "On the one hand is the white man, sombre, sullen, dogged, tremendous in his strength, and on the other, the black man, alert, cautious, brilliant in execution, self-proactive, and utterly confident. Of Jeffries, we asked the great question, has he retained that magic, unquenchable flame of youth? Of Johnson, we inquire, has he the bulldog courage to continue a losing fight if necessary, the heedlessness to fatigue and to bodily torture? Has he the heart?" And that was sort of how he felt after 4 rounds. Well, Jeffries was so overmatched. I mean, I don't know why you could even say this was even close in terms of boxing skills, that any questions that Beach may have had regarding the determination would not be relevant, basically. And Jeffries did manage to actually draw the first blood in round 4 as well from Johnson's mouth. Johnson had recently sustained an injury in his mouth during the sparring session, which had basically just reopened. The first blood scored was a customary indicator and word that Jeffries had scored first blood and was sent over the wires, giving the impression that Jeffries was actually winning the match, but he wasn't. But it was obvious to those in attendance that there was a clear difference in ability, especially obvious to the ungentlemanly Colbert, who actually taunted Johnson with a series of malicious racial insults, but the champion just smiled back at Colbert and then returned to his own taunts, while at the same time coolly keeping Jeffries at bay. As the rounds passed, Jeffries' face became increasingly marked, and it was obvious he was no longer the boxer he once was, or at least not of the standard to challenge Johnson. Impressively game but too fatigued to be effective, Jeffries might have met his end far sooner had Johnson not feared the ugly consequences of an early knockout. The tiring Jeffries could mount no competitive push, and by round 13 of the schedule 45, it was especially notable for the way that Johnson not only continued his taunting, but significantly picked up the pace.
There is no soundtrack to the film, but Johnson's never-closing rapid motor of a mouth leaves no doubt that he was still jabbering away while he pounded Jeffries' face with quick left jabs and right uppercuts. Jeffries did manage to launch a few double left hooks to the body and head, but they are the only signs of a comeback on the film. Johnson even smirked when one hook landed. Throughout most of the fight, however, Jeffries did little more than fall into clinches. He seemed to have forgotten how to fight. Johnson masterfully whirled and swung left and right hooks into Jeffries' battered face time and time again. He landed straight rights followed by right uppercuts that left Jeffries in a daze. At the end of round 13, Johnson measured Jeffries with a left and crashed home yet another overhand right. Tex Rickard steadied his straw hat as he watched and walked back and forth observing the fight. Johnson taunted his challenger in the 14th by saying, "How do you feel, Jim? How do you like it? Does it hurt?" Dazed and bleeding, Jeffries could barely keep his feet, while Corbett fell silent. By the end of the 14th, Jeffries' nose was broken, his eyes were swollen nearly shut, his shoulders and thighs were laced with blood, and he was desperately tired. Seated on his stool between rounds, gasping for air, he told his seconds he could hardly lift his arms. Everyone knew what was coming, but they sent him out for the 15th anyway. As round 15 unfolded, Johnson landed a left jab that drove Jeffries back onto the ropes. Jeffries clinched and pushed Johnson to the ring centre, but the champ freed his right hand and crashed in an uppercut that had Jeffries out on his feet. Big Jim stumbled back onto the ropes, whereupon Johnson landed 3 slapping left hooks that put Jeffries on the mat.
As Jim Jeffries struggled to get up, both Johnson and Tex Rickard watched with their hands on their hips like men waiting for a bus. Jeffries tried to pull himself up and Johnson hovered over him like a hawk. Rickard came in and grabbed Johnson's left shoulder as Jeffries struggled to his feet, but Johnson shook him off and smashed in a left hook that sent Jeffries sprawling through the ropes. His seconds and reporters helped him back into the ring. Jeffries then staggered across the canvas, where a combination put him down for the last time. Johnson stood over him again, ready to strike, should he manage to rise again. Rickard shoved Johnson back and began the count. Amid cries of, "Don't let the nigger knock him out." Jeffries' seconds had seen enough. Sam Berger stepped through the ropes in a deliberate disregard of the rules, helping Jeffries to his feet. Bob Armstrong threw in a towel as Johnson had his right cocked, but seemed worried about hitting the referee or one of Jeffries' seconds. Jim Corbett, he seemed to rush at Johnson, who turned as if to fight him. Finally, with Jeffries in a bloody heap, Tex Rickard stopped the fight and raised Jack Johnson's hand in victory. Across America, blacks poured onto the streets in celebration. Jeffries lay on the canvas in a miserable right state. His nose was broken, his eyes were shut, his tongue drooped as he turned the colour purple while he was gasping for air. When he was being led back to his corner at the end of the fight, Jeffries said, "I couldn't come back, boys. I couldn't come back." When Frida saw his beaten body and face, she fainted. She said when he came to, "Oh my papa, is it over at last?" Throughout his ordeal, he plodded forward as if he had forgotten how to fight, just mimicking the motions of a boxer.
Perhaps he believed the flattering praise of his followers, convinced that Johnson would surrender at his mere presence. Beaten before he even got to the ring, the white sports writers had claimed that the Anglo-Saxon race was superior, but Johnson, he crushed that illusion forever, and therein was the real reason for the hatred directed against him. Despite the predictions of violence if Johnson should win, the disillusioned fans at the scene gloomily accepted that the great Jim Jeffries had been thoroughly beaten. Considering the circumstances, the control of the Reno crowd was commendable. Johnson didn't hold back with his words after the fight when he said, "I could have fought for 2 hours longer. It was easy. Where is my lucky bathrobe? I'm going to give one of my gloves to Jeffries and the other to Corbett. I guess Jeff won't be so grouchy now. Somebody wired to my mother. I wish it was some longer. I was having lots of fun. Not one blow hurt me. He can't hit. He won't forget 2 punches I landed on him. He was only half the trouble Burns was." Jack London, who wrote some of the best descriptions of the fight in his ringside report, was so devastated by the KO in the 15th round that he didn't bother to describe the final blows, and he wrote, "It was pitiful. There happened to Jeff the bitterness that he had so often made others taste, but which for the first time perforce he was made to taste himself. He who had never been knocked down was knocked down repeatedly. He who had never been knocked out was knocked out. Never mind the technical decision, Jeff was knocked out. That is all there is to it. It is to be doubted if the old Jeff could have put away this amazing Negro from Texas.
The fighters released to the press the customary statements of the victor and the loser, and Jack Johnson said, "I won from Mr. Jeffries because I outclassed him in every department of the fighting game. Before I entered the ring, I was certain I would be the victor. I never changed my mind at any time. Jeffries' blows had no steam behind them, so how could he hope to defeat me? One thing I must give Jeffries credit for, the game battle he made. He came back at me with the heart of a true fighter. No man can say he did not do his best." So the Great White Hope, now the Great White No Hope, said, "I lost my fight this afternoon because I did not have the snap of my youth I used to have. I believed in my own heart that all the old-time dash was there, but when I started to execute, the speed and youthful steam were lacking. The things I used to do were impossible. I guess it's all my own fault. I was getting along nicely and living peacefully on my alfalfa farm, but when they started calling for me and mentioning me as a white man's hope, I guess my pride got the better of my good judgment. 6 years ago, the results might have been different, but now, well, I guess the public will let me alone after this." The loss to Johnson haunted Jim Jeffries for years. In his 1929 autobiography, Jeffries actually argued that he had been doped before the fight by a spy in his camp. But that story was discounted because, quite simply, it was a load of old bollocks. He got beaten because he was half the man he was. The man in the middle, Tex Rickard, gave his opinion on the fight. He said, "Jack Johnson is the most wonderful fighter that ever pulled on a glove. He won as he pleased from Jeffries and was never in any danger."
Rickard continued and said, "I could not help but feel sorry for the big white man as he fell beneath the champion's blows. It was the most pitiable sight I'd ever saw. As a matter of fact, I thought way down in my heart that Jeffries would be the winner of the fight. The fight was won and lost when Jeffries went through the ropes for the first time. This is official. The other knockdown does not count. It was this way. Jeffries was brought to his knees, and as he arose dazed, Johnson hit him with a succession of lefts that sent him through the ropes. As he lay there, several of his seconds caught hold of him and helped him to his feet. Under the rules of the game, which I have read thoroughly, while certain people were saying that I couldn't referee a fight, this disqualified Jeffries, and Johnson was the winner. I thought the seconds were going to carry Jeffries to his corner. Instead, they shoved him into the ring again to be beaten further, while I was doing all I could, during the confusion, to stop the fight. Jeffries could not hit Johnson, and Johnson could hit Jeffries whenever he pleased. Jeffries was just not as good as the last time he fought." Now, according to the official statement given by Tex Rickard, 15,760 people with paid tickets attended the event, and the gate brought in $270,755, a record for both attendance and gate. In addition to those who paid to see the fight, Rickard said there were 760 complimentary tickets given to the press and others. He estimated the numbers that slipped in at various places around the arena, breaking in tie holes in the boarding or climbing up the tie rim of the big structure at 1,500. So that made the total attendance given as 18,020 people.
I'd say that's pretty accurate because Tech is a sucker for numbers. He would have got every person he possibly could. Rickard's profit exceeded $100,000 after he had paid the bills and reimbursed Cole for his share of the money he loaned. By winning, Johnson netted the sum of $145,750,000. I mean, this is massive money back in the day. Jeffries earned $101,916. Huge sums for 1910. When reporters asked Tex if he planned to stay in the fight, promoting business, he actually answered, "Well, I can't say what I'll do, but it will have to be some big proposition to interest me, and I have nothing in mind. There is no man in the world fit to go against Johnson." The critics who belittled Johnson's previous victory over Tommy Burns as empty, claiming that Burns was a false champion since Jeffries had retired undefeated, now had to eat humble pie. John L. Sullivan actually commented at length after the fight that Johnson won deservedly, fairly and convincingly, which must have been very hard for him to write, considering the former champion was an absolute racist pig. But this is what he did admit. The fight of the century is over, and a black man is the undisputed champion of the world. It was a poor fight as fights go. This less than 15 round affair between James J. Jeffries and Jack Johnson. Scarcely has there ever been a championship contest that was so one-sided. All of Jeffries' much vaunted condition amounted to nothing. He wasn't in it from the first tap to the last. The Negro had few friends, but there was little demonstration against him. Spectators could not help but admire Johnson because he is the type of prize fighter that is admired by sportsmen. He played fairly at all times and fought fairly. What a crafty, powerful, cunning left hand Johnson has. He is one of the craftiest, cunning boxers that ever stepped into the ring. They both fought closely all during the 15 rounds. It was just the sort of fight that Jeffries wanted.
Sullivan continued with his assessment. He said, "There was no running or ducking like Corbett did with me in New Orleans in 1892. Jeffries did not miss so many blows because he had hardly started any. Johnson was on top of him all the time. Johnson didn't get confident at all with Jeffries in the beginning, and it was always the white man who clinched. But Johnson was very careful, and he backed away and took no chances, and was good-natured with it all. The best man won, and I was one of the first to congratulate him, and one of the first to also extend my heartfelt sympathy to the beaten man." Black Americans went rightfully into a frenzy all over the country. They took to the streets, singing, dancing and drinking to Jack Johnson. They were now a race of champions. One jubilant fan said, that evening, Johnson, his girlfriend and their entourage sped into Reno from Rick's Roadhouse to pick up the champion's earnings, $121,000, a sum that may have been larger than any black American had ever earned in a single day before. The money was nice, but the victory was sweeter. But as predicted, Johnson's win was greeted with violence. The whites were bitter and sore, so they took it out on any black person who showed support. Now we will go through these horrific stories that were printed post the Johnson-Jeffries bout, which all started within hours of the fight. Lynchings of African Americans were common in 1910, with 67 lynchings of African Americans occurring that year. Many white people were dismayed by the result of the fight and were angered by African Americans celebrating Johnson's victory and began attacking them. Within 2 days, 10 people had been killed in 6 different states. Riots occurred throughout the country in major cities such as Atlanta, Cincinnati, Houston, New York and St. Louis, as well as some smaller towns.
Now, we were just going to give you the number of those small towns, but I think it's more powerful to list them off. And they were Keystone, West Virginia and Mounds, Illinois, Baltimore, Chicago, Clarksburg, West Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Fort Worth, Johnson County, Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, Little Rock, Los Angeles, Louisville, New Orleans, Norfolk, Virginia, Omaha, Philadelphia, Roanoke, Virginia, Springfield, Illinois, St. Joseph's, Missouri, and Wheeling, West Virginia. They all saw racial disturbances, all of those states, all those little states and the big states. Incredible. And it is unknown how many people were actually killed and injured during the riots, but it was estimated that between 11 and 26 people were killed and hundreds more injured. Now, here is a short report, some short, some a little bit longer, from each state by state that was printed on what happened after the fight. So in Columbus, Ohio, around 400 black Americans held a parade in Columbus, Ohio, celebrating Johnson's victory, during which several brawls occurred. In Houston, Texas, a report from Houston read, Charles Williams, a Negro fight enthusiast, had his throat slashed from ear to ear on a streetcar by a white man, having announced too maliciously his appreciation of Jack Johnson's victory in Reno. In Louisiana, at least 3 black people were killed and several more severely injured after rioting in Shreveport, Louisiana. Severe unrest occurred in Madison and East Carroll parishes in Louisiana, where 2 black men were killed at Lake Providence. Rioting occurred in New Orleans as well. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 2 men were killed by white people. In Mounds, Illinois, 1 black person was killed, and according to the New York Times, 1 dead and 1 mortally wounded is the result of an attempt of 4 Negroes to shoot up the town. A Negro constable was killed when he attempted to arrest them. In New York City, New York, 11 separate riots erupted in New York within an hour of telegraphs announcing Johnson's victory. Mobs of white people stormed into black neighborhoods, throwing stones and setting fires to buildings and assaulting black people at will.
Sticking with New York City, white people attempted to lynch 2 black men. 1 black man was beaten to death and more than 100 others were injured. Several white people were stabbed or shot by black people in self-defense. In Norfolk, Virginia, over 300 white Navy sailors roamed the streets of Norfolk looking for black people. In Omaha, Nebraska, 2 black men were killed during rioting. In Pittsburgh, 3 separate riots occurred, and black people celebrating Johnson's victory were clubbed by police after they blocked streetcars and harassed passengers. In Pueblo, the entire police force was needed to quell a riot between black and white people. In Roanoke, a black person was fatally wounded. The Atlanta Constitution carried a report from Roanoke saying 6 Negroes with broken heads, 6 white men locked up, and 1 white man, Joe Chockley, with a bullet wound through his skull and probably fatally wounded, is the net result of clashes here tonight. In St. Louis, black people were confronted by police in 2 separate riots after they met white people with resistance. In Uvalde, during a race riot, white gunmen opened fire on a construction camp housing black workers. 3 black men were killed and 5 more injured. In Washington, D.C., mobs numbering as high as 7,000 people engaged in violence on the streets. 2 white men were stabbed to death by black people and hundreds were injured, and 236 people were arrested. In Wheeling, West Virginia, a black man driving an expensive car, just as the playboy Jack Johnson was famous for, was beset by a mob, dragged out from behind the steering wheel and hanged.
And lastly, in Wilmington, Delaware, a white man was attacked by a mob of black people who were in turn attacked by a large mob of white people who chased them for several blocks. Now, there were many other sickening stories across the country that described the clashes between the whites and blacks. Many were injured and properties was destroyed, demolished and burned. While there were no general estimates of the casualties, it is clear that Johnson's victory shook the nation and stirred racial animosity. Johnson was actually heartbroken when hearing of these horrific ordeals that his people were suffering. While still on the train back from Reno, heading east, he was actually greeted by all colours at every stop, all to congratulate him. Although there were the odd few mad white rednecks who tried to attack him, he actually told a reporter, "Just because my black fists happen to be too many for a pair of white fists," he said sadly, "if both colours knew the real Jack Johnson, they'll behave themselves like he does." And then he continued to say that the fellows that are making trouble over my victory at Reno ain't got no class. They're only scum. Upon arriving home in Galveston, he was actually greeted to a large gathering at his mother's house. The next day, he deposited more than that $100,000 in the First Trust and Savings Bank. He then bought a $3,000 car for his mum, wired a total of $4,000 to 8 friends in Galveston. 4 had been members of his old 11th Street and Avenue K gang. $750 went to Ed Harrison, according to the Los Angeles Examiner, his old-time trainer who actually taught Johnson how to fight on the docks. He also bought himself 2 new suits that he had promised he would when he was younger.
To demonstrate the hatred some felt towards Johnson, he was getting dressed for another night of celebration when he noticed a white man with a rifle out of his window walking up to his mum's house. The police were called and the man was arrested. He turned out to be a drunken Canadian-born mechanic from St. Louis named Richard McGurk, who had lost his savings betting on Jim Jeffries. His weapon was unloaded when he was seized, but the police believed he'd come to town to kill Johnson. Unbelievably, Johnson did not press charges. It took 3 days for the trains to remove all of the fight visitors from Reno, Nevada. All the while, the country were fighting amongst themselves. After the riots, many states and local governments banned the motion picture film depicting the fight out of fear that showing the fight would spark more race riots. Johnson's victory on the 4th of July 1910 shook the nation. Instantly, many cities and towns put out official announcements that they would not allow the exhibition of the Johnson-Jeffries fight film. A day after the fight, newspapers published strong statements expressing intentions to ban the film from officials in Atlanta, Baltimore, Boston, Cincinnati, the District of Columbia, Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, Los Angeles and St. Louis. The New York Times claimed that the fatalities across the country resulted from fight occasioned by the Johnson victory at Reno, and argued that public officials acted to prevent the exhibition of the fight film to avoid race riots. The Chicago Daily Tribune predicted that moving pictures of the Johnson-Jeffries fight probably will be prohibited in many of the larger cities of the country through fear of the renewal of race bitterness as well as a possible lowering of the moral tone of the people. Local newspapers made stronger statements about the quickly forming wave of censorship.
And for example, the Beaumont Daily Journal of Beaumont, Texas, reported the moving pictures of the Jeffries-Johnson prize fight are to be barred from nearly every city in the United States. The feeling of race prejudice that came in the wake of the fight has led many cities to adopt ordinances prohibiting the exhibition of the film. It is more than probable that the moving picture men will not attempt to bring the pictures into the South. Even in the absence of any law prohibiting the display of the films in the southern states, the strife that would be certain to come from the exhibitions would probably cause many motion picture men in the South to think twice before he would book the pictures. Now, when the film footage was ready to be released to the public, many important figures, all white of course, including the former president Theodore Roosevelt, all gathered together to ban them from being shown in theatres. Their reason was to prevent more race riots and stop black Americans from thinking that they were better than the white race. Even the British Empire banned them from Britain and from their other colonies, which included India. On July 6, 1910, 2 days after the fight, public officials escalated their statements against the exhibition of the film. The newspapers reported that at least 9 states and 41 towns banned prize fight films or were about to adopt such censorship laws to prevent the exhibition of the Johnson-Jeffries fight films within their jurisdictions. Mayors who did not instantly join the social movement to ban the film of the fight were singled out and subject to substantial media exposure, and the New York Daily Tribune, for example, provided a typical account of this when they said, standing out from many other large cities throughout the country in the fight against the exhibition of the Johnson-Jeffries fight pictures, the mayors of New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Portland and Seattle announced that they will take no action hostile to the pictures.
The General Secretary of the United Society of Christian Endeavour, William Shaw, sent a telegram to President Taft, former President Theodore Roosevelt, all the state governors and the mayors of key cities, and the telegram read, "Race riots and murder already follow the announcement of Johnson's victory. Moving pictures of prize fight will create more violence. Will you join in appeal to authorities, cities and towns to prohibit pictures as law provides? Help save our young people from these demoralising shows. Wire answer." To reporters, Secretary Shaw explained his proposed legal strategy. He believed that existing legal mechanisms were sufficient to prevent the exhibition of the Johnson-Jeffries fight film and that no censorship laws were needed. He said, "The time has come for the Christian and moral forces of the country to rise up and demand the suppression of these moving pictures. The city and town authorities have the power to forbid the exhibition of immoral and degrading pictures under penalty of revoking the licence. No additional laws are needed. All that is required is an aroused public sentiment that will demand immediate action on the part of the authorities before the floodgates are opened." On July 7, 1910, 3 days after the fight, many states and cities already declared that they would not allow the exhibition of the Johnson-Jeffries film in their jurisdictions. Sigmund Lubin, a prominent moving picture pioneer who headed the syndicate, realised the censorship mania put the syndicate's significant investments at risk and threatened the future of the motion picture industry. He released an announcement to the press stating, "We have spent too much money not to make a fight to exhibit our pictures, and we are confident that the effort to prevent us showing them will not succeed when the courts interpret the laws bearing on the case."
So Lubin continued, "We spent upward of $200,000 to get perfect pictures of that fight. We had special lenses made and 12 machines at the ring. After all these expenses and trouble, we do not mean to yield to our opponents without a struggle." But on the morning of the third day after the fight, it was evident that a national movement had formed and was growing. Secretary Shaw provided the press with the list of cooperating politicians and those who may not comply with the demands of his movement, and with this list issued a statement expressing his intention to crash the syndicate that produced and intended to dispute the Johnson-Jeffries fight film. He said, "All that has been done thus far in the fight to prohibit the exhibition of the moving pictures of the Reno prize fight has been but primarily schemishing for proposal. If the syndicate controlling the pictures intends to appeal to the courts for protection, the only reason given is the financial one. Demoralization of our young people, the graduation of manhood, and the destruction of life do not count. We accept the challenge, and if I know anything about the temper of our people, the syndicate will be in worse condition when the fight is over than Jim Jeffries was when his seconds threw up the sponge. This is to be a fight to the finish, and I hope the decent people of every city, town will get into it at once. If the authorities are blind, let the people open their eyes. The men interested in the fight are in the minority, while the women and children are practically unanimous against it. Let the voice of the mothers be heard on this question." In the end, the syndicate admitted defeat and bowed down to the country's demands.
The syndicate that had invested in the Johnson-Jeffries fight film paid Johnson $50,000 and Jeffries $66,666 for the royalty rights. It expected to collect $1 million during July and did not anticipate a massive censorship wave that would undermine the profitability of its undertaking. The decentralised nature of the censorship movement made it financially impossible to fight against local censorship rules. The syndicate threatened to resort to courts in multiple jurisdictions to fight censorship laws and actions, but it had no funds to engage in a broad legal war across the country. 3 days after the fight, the New York Times published a letter to the editor from the chairman of the Good Citizenship Committee of the United Society of Christian Endeavour. This letter presented the Society's position on prize fighting and censorship of fight films. It reads, "The states and territories of the United States, with the exception of the little state of Nevada, showed their disapproval of the late prize fight by refusing to allow the contestants to engage in it within their respective jurisdictions. It is a little surprising that so many of these states have not shown a similar sense of morality by refusing to allow the reproduction of this barbarous fight in thousands of moving picture shows where the minds of boys and girls, the future citizens of America, will be tainted, corrupted and brutalized by such scenes." Eventually, the films were shown without incident in several large cities in the US, which included Kansas City, Missouri, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, and Hoboken, New Jersey. Now, after all this had happened, Jack Johnson actually didn't see the need to return to the ring because in his mind there were no worthy white challengers for his title. He was correct, but many black challengers were worthy, the likes of Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette or Sam McVeigh. The trouble was, he knew that those three black heavyweights in particular would have caused him great difficulty. So, in a turn of events, he drew the reverse colour line.
Incredible. I mean, the unbelievableness of these fight films. I mean, it's insane, isn't it? I think went on for 20 years, that as well. Something ridiculous where the films were never allowed to be shown to anybody. Johnson, reverse colour line. Well, he would spend exactly 2 years out of the ring after that Jeffries fight, and he had begun to drink a little bit more than normal, and later admitted that I was not myself for a year after the Jeffries fight. He sometimes claimed to have suffered from what he called brain fever. Well, Johnson was, we alluded to this earlier, but Johnson was actually sentenced to a year in prison for violating the Mann Act. And I'm going to again point you in the direction of our career profiles on Jack Johnson for more details on this. But rather than do his time, he actually fled the country and continued fighting abroad for 7 years until 1920, when he finally returned to serve his sentence in a federal penitentiary. Johnson went on to defend his world title 3 more times before losing it to Jess Willard in a controversial fight in 1915. Still don't believe it. I still think he took a dive. But like many fighters, Johnson fought on for longer than he should have, and finally retired officially in 1931. He finished his incredible career with a record of 54 victories, 34 by way of knockout, 11 losses and 8 draws. Johnson operated several businesses during his time, including lucrative endorsement deals, but sadly died in a car crash in 1946 at the age of 68. He is buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. In 2018, Jack Johnson, with some prompting from actor Sylvester Stallone, was formally pardoned by the US President Donald Trump for violating the ridiculous Mann Act. So for Jim Jeffries, the Jack Johnson fight was his last as a professional, ending his boxing career with a record of 19 wins, 16 by knockout, 1 defeat and 2 draws. And we've got a little quote from him speaking in 1936 again. He said, after the Reno thing, there was a long time when I didn't want to talk. There wasn't much I could have said anyway, without sounding like a rotten sport. But that's all over with now, and if there's anybody to be sore at, I don't know who it is.
Jeffries continued, and he said, Reno does not hurt me now, any more than the last sock old Fitz hits me with. If anybody gets a kick out of punching the bag about those old times, then throw me with him, and I'll give it a good old going over. In retirement, Jeffries owned a bar and a farm where he bred prize cattle, although a series of poor investments forced him to declare bankruptcy in the 1920s. He also performed in boxing exhibitions, continued with his vaudeville shows, and acted in movies. In his later years, Jeffries trained boxers and worked as a fight promoter. He promoted many fights out of a structure known as Jeffries Barn, which was located on his alfalfa ranch in California. His ranch house was on the southeast corner until the 1960s. Jeffries Barn is now part of Knott's Berry Farm, a Southern California amusement park. 7 years after suffering a stroke, Jeffries died on March 3, 1957, in bed at his home in the presence of his niece Lillian Bull. Bull had been living with Jeffries as his housekeeper, and he had instructed her to call a doctor. Jeffries died before the doctor arrived. The doctor, William N. Nethery, attributed his death to a heart attack caused by coronary thrombosis. His body was interred in the Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California. And that there ends the tale of Johnson and Jeffries. One hell of a tale for the final episode of Season 4. And a lot of you guys that listens to our show that love the old style episodes, the old school episodes, as we like to call them. This is one of the most definitive ones that we have covered for this series, because it is a pioneering fight. It is an original fight of the century. When people term these fights of the century or fights of the decade, you always think of specific fights in particular, and this one certainly is right up there at the top of that list, because it is the original mega fight. It is the original fight that people wanted to see. It is like looking at fights between the likes of Mayweather-Pacquiao, or you're looking at the fights where Mike Tyson was involved, and you look at the fights where you see all these megastars fighting one another. Maybe even looking at this season and you think of Canelo Golovkin and how much of an anticipated fight that was. Whilst there wasn't the same undertones that sat within some of those fights, this fight in particular was so significant in its own right that it was necessary to cover it for this episode. And like I said at the start of the show, there is a lot of people that have asked us to cover Jim Jeffries, and we will do a Jim Jeffries career profile in the future because there's been that many requests for it that we can't ignore the fact that people want to see us do a Jim Jeffries career profile. So I hope for those that have really wanted us to do something on Jim Jeffries, this has been a real eye-opener for you guys. It's specifically, of course, around the Johnson fight, but there are many more stories that we haven't included because they will come in the future episodes. But if you haven't heard the Jack Johnson career profile, now's probably a good time to go and listen to it. You've heard this tale. If you haven't heard Jack Johnson's career profile, it is a two-parter. It is that long, so please do go back and listen to that on the career profiles feed, and it ties in nicely with this episode. But just going back to this tale then, Johnston, my thoughts and feelings on it are that I'm very much more educated than what I once was before. Having done Jack's career profile together, we knew so many different stories, but adding more layers into this particular tale, I didn't really understand and fully comprehend how much effort was put in by certain individuals and certain groups to prevent this fight from being aired to the public so that people couldn't see this fight. That was one of the big things that I took away from doing this episode, was that I didn't really fully comprehend and appreciate how much effort was put in to try and stop this fight from ever being seen. Now, I'm kind of glad in a lot of ways that came and went, because we would have never got to see any footage of this fight, and we would literally be doing this fight based on descriptions of what people around the time was able to provide in autobiographies or in different literature. So the fact that we have got something out there to be able to go back and look at also accompanies this tale and also accompanies Jack Johnson's career, of course, as well. But overall, it's been a thoroughly enjoyable and educating episode, and I hope that everybody else has enjoyed it. So, Johnston, I'm going to come to you now, of course, for your final thoughts and feelings on this tale between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries.
Yeah, I think the one thing, it was always a fight I've always been wanting to do. The one thing that stood out to me was how early Jack Johnson and Jeffries' fight could have happened. I did realise the one thing I learned from this tale is that for me, in my head, for some reason, I assumed that Johnson was a little bit further down. I believe we touched on it in his career profile with a few call-outs, but I didn't really feel that Jeffries was around long enough to have fought him, but he was in his peak of his powers, and he could have fought him, and he should have fought him, and I think he run from him. That is another fighter that I feel avoided another black fighter. You know, you had it with Sullivan and Jackson, you know, and you had it with Jeffries early with Johnson. Anyway, Johnson was always inevitably going to win that title, and then obviously Johnson doing the reverse colour line on Sam Langford and Jeanette and Sam McVeigh. But either way, that is the one thing that stood out to me. I was quite surprised. I just assumed he was pretty much retired when Johnson was at the top of his game. But yeah, interesting, that really was. It's incredible to think that people actually thought that Jeffries weighing, I think the highest reported weight he was when he was on his farm was like 320 odd pounds. I mean, he was massive. He was a fat boy. To have reduced the amount of weight he did is almost like the Tyson Fury thing. But Tyson Fury came back and fought average fights. He didn't go straight into a championship fight. Maybe even Fury may even look to this at some point and probably thought, well, that's why I ain't going to do that, because I could end up like Jeffries. But yeah, look, Johnson was just too good for the fella. The fight was also one-sided, and he could have took him out early. But he was a fear that they would attack him, and probably there would be huge fights within that crowd of those sort of 18,000 that were in that stadium at the time. So in a way, he probably saved himself and other fans that watched him from having a mad riot then. But the lynchings, and I mean, it's just awful to think that it was so apparent in 1910. I mean, in a century-old fight, but yet it still just baffles me that was the case. But you know, racism was so high and the segregation was there, and this fight had a lot more undertones to it. And then you had that religious element to it as well, and some of the craziness from these secretaries of states and things where they're sort of saying how barbaric this fight was. I mean, are you kidding me? It's a fight. It was just a fight, a boxing match where your white guy got beaten the shit out of, basically. And what the problem was, you didn't want to witness it and show it to your kids and your women. The irony of it is, I still believe that if it had been the other way around, they wouldn't have had no problem showing it. So I think that one of the other guys summed it up, the Reverend fella, I can't remember his name, Reverend Reverald or whatever his name was. He was like, you're getting people getting lynched, black African Americans getting lynched and burned to death, and that's okay. But a fight where a black man beats up a white man can't be shown on film because it's bad for the children and the women. It's like, it's just beyond me how fucking stupid people were back then. I think that's what infuriates me with the fight and everything around it. But look, it had to be done. It had to be told. We've always wanted to do it, and it's been in the pipeline pretty much every season we do these, and this was the one I'm finally glad we got done. And I think we've done a definitive description of the whole fight. Don't judge Jeffries, no matter what he says. He was racist, that many of the white fighters were back then, but I wouldn't judge Jeffries on this fight. You got to judge Jeffries on what he'd done before the 6 years before he came out of retirement. And as someone said, or I mentioned earlier, you can't judge Muhammad Ali on his fight with Larry Holmes, like you can't judge Joe Lewis on his fight with Rocky Marciano. If they were the only fight films for those two black fighters, we would be saying, well, what have they ever bought? They were useless. But in actual fact, Jeffries was a terrific fighter when he was at his peak.
And it was really good to point out a lot of these things for people to really understand the context of Jim Jeffries as well. So I think, like we said, despite the fact that he had his flaws about him, and there were many big flaws about him, the career profile on him is going to be a really interesting tale for us to cover down the line, because it will be one that we're able to look at some of the more facets of his personality and how he was as a fighter and an individual as well. But that brings an end to this particular episode, folks. So before we bring an end to the final episode of Season 4, we just want to say a massive, massive thank you to everybody for listening to this show for this season. We really, really appreciate the support, all the comments, all the shares and the likes and the retweets and everything that you've done to put the episodes out there and let everybody know about this series. Thank you so much to everybody for doing that for this particular season. We are looking to bring the season back for another season next year, and there will be a after show as well. But in the meantime, guys, please, if you haven't heard the whole of the season and you're just picking this episode up at this point, or you're very new to the show, please do go back and listen to the previous seasons. There are many, many great tales, many great episodes out there. And if you have not seen our Patreon membership service, this would be a good time to go and have a look, because we do produce these episodes and put them out earlier for everybody who subscribes to us via Patreon. They get them completely ad-free as well, and they also get access to Patreon-only content. And as this year progresses, there will be new Patreon-only content going out on there. We will be finishing our exclusive series, Boxing Through the Decades, and there will be many more new facets being involved in the Patreon membership service. So please check us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. If you've been listening to this on Spotify or you've been listening on YouTube, please drop a comment below about what you thought of this particular episode, any thoughts and feelings around both of these fighters and the tale that we've produced for this episode. It would be really appreciated. If you are listening on Apple, please make sure you leave a rating and a review. It is greatly appreciated to support the podcast. Well, that is it for this particular episode and the finale of Season 4 of Legendary Nights. You've been listening to the tale of Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network.
Oh, wonderful shot by Lennox Lewis.
A right hand by Holyfield.
By Buster Douglas, look at this. He's knocked Mike Tyson down for the first time in his career.
But unfortunately, it'll never happen.
Front punches, and it's over.
I think it's going to be over.
Aguero in big trouble against the ropes.
I have to say there seems an element of genuine hate between these two, Ambrose.
For sure. I don't hate the man.
Just imagine if you bought a ticket. Stop it, Frank. You can stop it any time. Castillo's in trouble. Weak steps in, and the fight is over. Oh!